All right. Okay. Okay, yep. All right, folks, I think we're going to get started. Good evening and welcome to tonight's joint meeting of the Indian Point Closure Task Force and the Decommissioning Oversight Board. I want to thank Supervisor Becker for hosting us and want to thank all of you in the community, both here in person and online, for your continued engagement in our important work. I also want to thank our federal partners. I know Jerry Shapiro from Senator Schumer's office is with us virtually. Thank you, Jerry. We have representatives as well from neighboring towns. I want to welcome Supervisor Levenberg from Ossining, and I'm sure there are others as well. So thank you all for your engagement. Next slide, please. So just to go over a few logistics, number one and most important issue for the panelists, speak into the mic. And please introduce yourself when you speak so folks know who you are. And following that rule, this is Tom Congdon. I am the chair of the Indian Point Closure Task Force and chair of the Decommissioning Oversight Board. I'm also the executive deputy at the Department of Public Service. Also important for the virtual panelists, just know that you are muted upon entry. So if you'd like to speak, you'll need to unmute yourself. The public forum will begin immediately after our emergency preparedness presentations. So those of you who had submitted questions on that topic for the July meeting's public forum, we will be getting to those questions today, time permitting, but that's the number one priority for the forum. Staff will unmute participants when it's your turn to speak. So if you're lined up, having submitted some questions, we'll call you to your mic if you're participating virtually, or to the mic here in the room at the podium, and our administrative law judge will take your questions. And also just a note to please reserve the chat feature for reporting technical issues. That's what it's left on for. To the extent that there are substantive questions submitted through the chat, we will, as always, endeavor to answer those before the next meeting. Next slide, please. Now I'd like to quickly go through roll call. We have a number of people here in person and several participating virtually. So I'll start with State Rep Senator Pete Harcum.
Here on Zoom.
Thanks, Senator. Assemblywoman Galiff.
I'm here in person.
Thank you. From the Department of Public Service, our counsel, John Sipos.
Here. Good evening.
From the Department of Environmental Conservation, Kelly Turturro.
Here.
From the Department of State, Mark Pattison. Or is he represented by Mike Morris, I believe? Mike Morris, are you on virtually? Mike? Okay, come back around. Mark Masrani from Department of Tax and Finance.
I'm here on Zoom.
Thank you. Jennifer Waka from Division of Homeland Security and Emergency Services.
Here.
Thank you. Tom Scaglione from ESD. Tom? Okay, move on. Joe Leary from NYPA.
Here on Zoom.
Thank you. Lise Peterson from NYSERDA.
Here.
Thank you. David Lockbaum, our independent technical expert.
Remote from Chattanooga.
Thank you, David. I believe Richard Webster may be joining virtually, but we also have Victoria Ling from Riverkeeper. Victoria?
Yes, here.
Welcome. And Richard, are you on virtually? Okay. And now for our local reps, Supervisor Becker.
Present.
Thank you. I know Mayor Knickerbocker was planning to attend virtually. Mayor, are you with us?
Yes, here on Zoom.
Hi. Susan
Hi.
Spear from Westchester County.
Here.
Is Catherine Borgia with us? Westchester County Legislature. Not yet. And Legislator Colin Smith? Okay. Superintendent of the Hendrick Hudson School District, Joe Hochreiter?
Here.
Thank you. And now our labor representatives. I know Lou Picani couldn't be here tonight, but he's represented by Al Vittori. Al?
Here.
Hi, thank you. Is Bill Smith with us? Okay. And I know Tom Carey couldn't make it. So is there anyone present who I did not call on? We have staff with us as well, but oh, hi, yes, and welcome. We have a few additional folks with us who will be on hand to answer questions during the public forum. So I'll just actually let them introduce themselves. So start with Roberto.
How's it going? Roberto Rosario, Chief of the Verplank Fire District.
Thanks for being with us. We have Rich Baroni from
Rich
Holtec.
Baroni, IPEC Site Vice President.
Thank you. And we have staff from the DPS. Bridget.
Bridget Freimeyer, Department of Public Service.
And our resident inspector.
Cliff Chapin, State Inspector.
Thank you. From Westchester County.
Dennis DeBorgo, Westchester County Emergency Services.
Thank you, Dennis. Okay, so next slide, please. So, as you can see, we've got another full agenda, and we are going to endeavor to stay on schedule. We made a decision this time around to skip our normal updates from Holtec and from the state agencies performing regular oversight. But Decommissioning Oversight Board members did receive slide decks with updates from both Holtec and the DPS and other agency oversight activities. And those slide decks are posted on our website for the public to look at as well. Notably in the state updates, we included confirmation of the minimum fund balances, which was important for Assemblywoman Galiff at the last meeting, so we'll make that a regular check-in. But did you have a question?
Could I ask, because in the updates from Holtec
Yes.
about the expenditures for Indian Point 1, I don't think there was, I can understand spent fuel management, and I can understand site restoration, but I'm a novice about license termination and what that means, because that's the largest pot of money. Like for Indian Point 1, it's 400, I have different glasses on, 485 million. And for Indian Point 2, it's 475 million. So that's 10 million less for a newer plant, and I don't understand that. And then it's 583 million for Indian Point 3. So I think we need to have a definition of what's that about. And I did look through the materials, and maybe there was a definition in there.
Yeah.
I didn't
see
find
it.
one.
Well,
So
should we answer, is there a way to answer that now, Rich or John Sipos, or do you want to chime in?
I'll have to get back to Cindy. I'll record everything that she needs and I'll get back.
Okay.
right, just
More detail.
more detail. This
Got
just
it.
doesn't give enough.
Okay.
And I want to know, I kind of want to know when you're talking about license termination, if it involves, any of the other plants that Holtec owns. Because I don't know whether we're merging some of that together.
If it's a discussion on the balance, I would think it's only about the Indian Point Trust Fund.
Yeah, it wouldn't be any other plant besides Indian Point, but I'll get the details.
Okay. I'd like that in writing.
Sure.
Okay. So, as I said, so we had those, and we're joined by Westchester County Board of Legislature, Catherine Borgia. Thank you. Rest of the agenda. Today, we're going to focus more on emergency preparedness. We have had this on the agenda for the last two meetings. We've not gotten to it. We're finally going to have that presentation. And it's also timely that our community guest speaker tonight, Tina Volz-Bonger, is also interested in giving a presentation on community concerns about emergency preparedness and response plans. And so we'll have those two presentations followed by, as I said earlier, the public forum dealing with emergency preparedness questions that we received at the previous public forum but didn't have time to get to. Following the public forum, we will then have an update from the monitoring working group that's been working on developing a monitoring plan focused on the school community, but also taking into account the larger community as well. So we'll give an update on where things stand there, and then we'll adjourn. So next slide, please. So with that, I am going to now turn it over to Jennifer Waka from the Division of Homeland Security and Emergency Services to walk us through some slides and get the discussion started on emergency preparedness. But before I do turn to her, I want to also just acknowledge that this is a joint meeting of the task force and the Decommissioning Oversight Board. We've not had a lot of business for the task force. We did file, as per the statute, our annual report, so that's been finalized. It's just updates on all of our activities. We know that the cessation fund is working as it was intended and making funds available to the taxing jurisdictions as they start to incur the loss of pilot revenue from Indian Point, so that's working as intended. But other than those activities, I wanted to ask members if they had any other questions or updates on task force type related activities before we jump into the rest of the agenda.
Yeah, just briefly, if I may, it's
Yeah.
more of a thank you to our state elected officials, certainly Sandy Galiff to my right, and Senator Pete Harcum. They've been instrumental in ensuring that the school district receives its full entitlement to the cessation fund that has really closed the gap for our school district and our taxpayers. Certainly our financial projections are much more palatable today because of their work and the work of this committee and our chairperson to make sure those funds are there. Recently, about a month ago, we secured an additional $1 million of state aid to offset any future tax spikes because of the closure of Indian Point. So I want to thank the work of this committee and certainly Senator Harcum and Assemblywoman Gale.
It's terrific news. Any other updates or questions on the agenda before we turn it over to Jennifer? Go ahead.
I'm sorry. Because this is also a task force meeting, there was $15 million allocated when the plant was closed.
Yes.
To go to certain organizations and groups. Do we know whether that money has been allocated and spent?
Yeah.
Or are we still in limbo with a lot of the projects?
We are making progress on a number of the projects. Money has been spent for example, the labor training project that went to the Teamsters, and that's up and running. I actually want to come and take a tour of that.
It's working out well.
And
We have members training on it already,
that's terrific.
and some from Indian Point, actually.
Excellent. So the whole point of that, remember, was to train Teamsters members on getting their commercial driver's license so that they could be available for additional work. Right? So that's a good. We've got the Historic Hudson Valley grant that went out, and that work is underway, is my understanding. The sewer project, there's been a lot of discussions and a lot of meetings between the town and the village to work out intermunicipal agreements. I think that work is ongoing, but probably a good topic to catch up on maybe at the next meeting in December to get a status on where things stand on that. And then, of course, we have the $500,000 that's earmarked for the monitoring program that we'll be discussing later on in this meeting. And then there was the money that was made available for the ongoing Hudson River studies, and that's been all executed, all the contracts executed, and work is continued for the studies, right, Kelly?
Correct, Tom.
Yeah, but perhaps it would be worthwhile to go deeper dive into these projects at the December meeting.
Okay.
Okay.
That sounds like a good idea.
Okay, good. Okay, any other task force or questions on the agenda? Okay, Jennifer. With that, welcome Jennifer Waka from Division of Homeland Security and Emergency Services.
Thank you. And thank you for the opportunity to present to the members of the board and to the community this evening on emergency preparedness, management, and response. On behalf of my local, my county, and my state preparedness partners. Collaborating partners in this presentation included Holtec, Enbridge, the Verplank Fire District, Westchester County Department of Emergency Services, and New York State agencies, including Departments of Public Service, Health, Environmental Conservation, and New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. I would also like to note that it is my sincere privilege to work with all of these partners to build and sustain preparedness for a wide spectrum of potential emergencies, including as relates to the Indian Point site. Next slide. Several topical areas will be covered over the course of this presentation, commencing with an overview of emergency operations planning and concluding with considerations for how the risk is changing at this location. Next slide. First, an overview of emergency planning. An emergency operations plan is an organization's or a community's plan for responding to a variety of potential hazards. Plans are developed to be flexible and adaptable for responding entities to react proportionately to the actual situation or the circumstances. EOPs are often comprised of a base plan and further elaborated on with functional and hazard-specific annexes. The base plan and supporting documents are determined by the community or facility based on risk and vulnerability and developed to guide implementation of emergency functions such as sheltering and hazard-specific responses such as hazardous materials or hurricanes. Plan types range in content and detail from the strategic, which is that highest level of framework guiding response activities, to the operational, which describes roles, responsibilities, tasks, integration requirements, and actions of an organization or jurisdiction during actual or potential incidents. And lastly, a tactical, which focus on managing resources such as personnel and equipment that play a role in any given incident. Relating to this site specifically and to the immediate area more generally, fire departments have standard operating guides to guide their tactical response activities such as fire suppression. Holtec has operations plans that guide their on-site response for potential radiological emergency. Westchester County has an all-hazards emergency operations plan and a supporting Indian Point Radiological Emergency Annex. And New York State has a comprehensive emergency management plan with supporting radiological annex for fixed nuclear power plant sites. From these foundations, the actual event shapes the requirements and which plans, procedures, and guidelines are ultimately activated. This is informed by the specific event risk profile, as well as the scope and scale of the actual or the potential impacts from what has occurred. A car fire, a building fire, a hazardous materials release, a potential radiological emergency. Each type requires different or scaled decisions and actions to protect the public and property. Next slide. Emergency response coordination begins during the preparedness phase. A basic tenet of emergency preparedness is understanding that emergencies start and end locally. This is a factor essential to the emergency planning process. The consequences of any given event are experienced by the site footprint or the local community first. Local agencies, such as fire and law enforcement, will typically comprise the initial response to protect lives and property and mitigate the impacts. Expanding layers of support may include the village, the town, the county, the state, and/or federal resources. And lastly, the community remains when the response transitions back to pre-emergency status or recovery efforts. From this perspective, and as established by FEMA planning guidance, emergency operations plans are developed and maintained to include the following elements: identifying the departments and agencies designated to perform response and recovery activities and specifies the tasks that they are expected to accomplish. It outlines the integration of assistance available to local jurisdictions during disaster situations that generate emergency response and recovery needs beyond what the jurisdiction can satisfy. Procedures and systems that alert, notify, recall, and dispatch emergency response personnel. Processes and systems for warning and providing information to the public. measures to protect residents or community members and property, processes to request aid and/or support from other jurisdictions, the state and the federal government. EOPs provide coordinating instructions and provisions for implementing mutual aid as applicable, and describes the logistical support for planned operations. When developing or updating emergency operations plans, the emergency response partners are identified and, as relevant, reflect potential layers of assistance that may be requested or activated to build capacity or capability. These range from local, county, state, and federal organizations across many disciplines. For example, the Verplank Fire District has pre-planned mutual aid partners in the surrounding area. Westchester County has developed processes to coordinate additional fire suppression resources from across various agencies within the county. And the state has a mutual aid plan to guide additional resource support from outside of the county and across the state. Responding entities are ultimately tailored to the nature of the incident and framed by the specific scope of the event. Holtec, Enbridge, Verplank Fire, Village of Buchanan Police, Westchester County Police, Westchester Department of Emergency Services, and New York State agencies have developed plans, procedures, and guidelines for a range of emergency response operations that may be scaled and adapted to differing events. Next slide. Framing this in the context of an incident. An incident occurs and is identified. This could be a vehicle accident, it could be a building on fire, it could be a hazardous material spill, or a potential radiological incident. The second block represents notification and response to the incident. The facility, a member of the public, or the jurisdiction identifies the incident and communicates it, for example, as a call to 911 or as reported by facility personnel. Procedures guide notification and dispatch of response agencies based on the reported nature of the emergency. Agencies respond and revise resources and coordination structure based on assessment of the actual conditions or impacts. Events with focused impacts may be handled via an on-site incident command management, meaning a focused incident coordination structure that is at or proximal to the incident. Events with wider impacts may also activate or trigger the activation of additional coordination and response structures, including the Westchester County and the New York State Emergency Operations Centers. The third block here represents what actions responding entities take to protect people and property. This includes measures considered and implemented to mitigate or reduce consequences. Activities to protect members of the public include, but are not limited to, providing warning, securing the area, sheltering individuals, or implementing an evacuation, and informing the public. While options are identified in EOPs, the actual actions taken will be coordinated and tailored to the nature of the incident. And lastly, recovery. Recovery from an emergency may be minimal, or it may require a longer duration and/or additional government and non-governmental resources to return the community to a pre-emergency status. Next slide. As relates to the area of the Indian Point facility, and as referenced earlier slides, this list represents potential emergency response entities. This is not an exhaustive list, this is not a minimum list, but it's a useful illustration. Holtec for the Indian Point site, Enbridge for the pipeline. Local responders include Verplank Fire District, the Village of Buchanan Police Department, as well as the Village of Buchanan and the Town of Cortland governments. Westchester County response entities include, but are also not limited to, the County Police, the County Department of Emergency Services, and the County Department of Health. State response entities could include the New York State Police, the Department of Environmental Conservation, the Division of Homeland Security and Emergency Services, the Department of Health, the Department of Public Service, and the ISERTA, the state's Energy Research and Development Authority. Federal response partners include but are not limited to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and the Federal Emergency Management Agency. Roles and responsibilities of these entities range from fire suppression, securing the incident scene, providing technical support to inform decision-making, and coordinating multi-agency and multi-jurisdictional response actions. While these essential emergency response partners are identified here, activation of specific entities are scaled to the incident requirements, such as the hazard, the consequences, and the actions required to protect public and property. Next slide. How is the public alerted to an actual or a potential emergency? Response partners have a range of tools at their disposal to maximize getting emergency instructions and information out to those that may be impacted by differing emergency events. Community members are encouraged to sign up for notifications to maintain awareness irrespective of the event or the hazard type. Text, email, phone notification systems are hosted by jurisdictions, providing a platform for individuals to specify how they'd like to be notified. This is a list of what's currently available, including Cortland, Buchanan's, Westchester counties, and New York Alert sign-up initiatives. Alert and warning tools range as well. The Emergency Alert System, or EAS, which when activated broadcasts a tone and a message via radio and TV. Many may have familiarity with this, for example, when the National Weather Service issues tornado warnings. Wireless emergency alerts, or WEAs. These are the concise messages that open up on cell phones targeted in a defined geographical area. Individuals may have experienced receiving Amber Alerts issued by law enforcement or severe weather warnings as issued by the National Weather Service. Thirdly, the NOAA Weather Radio. This is an alerting resource that's been available for many years. It's a targeted and also as a part of a component of the Indian Point Plan, targeted tone alerts radios have been distributed as part of the preparedness activities. It's also important to note here that there is the Indian Point siren system. These special sirens are specific to the 10-mile emergency planning zone for Indian Point and may be activated to alert the public. When activated, these sirens have a continuous 4-minute tone. This is a long, high-pitched siren, and on behalf of my colleagues, not to be confused with the fire department siren. Sirens are a tool to alert the public to tune into an EAS station for more information about an emergency at Indian Point. The Indian Point siren system, maintained by Holtec, is tested quarterly. Partners also coordinate and collaborate to share information during emergencies via a range of additional mediums to maximize getting the word out and getting the instructions out. These include press statements, press briefings, as well as leveraging key social media platforms. Next slide. EOPs and emergency response in general are further supported through training and exercise programs. Training is offered broadly and tailored to specific disciplines or roles and responsibilities to build and sustain responder skills, knowledge, and abilities that may be required during a response. For example, facility and/or resource owners such as Holtec and Enbridge provide training on site-specific hazards and response considerations. Fire and EMS agencies conduct training for personnel to develop hands-on skills and knowledge of response procedures. The county and state develop and conduct training for a range of hazards and response activities, including the capabilities and actions identified in the various radiological emergency plans. And additionally, FEMA is a vital source of training on many preparedness functions, including emergency response planning and the incident command system leveraged for managing incidents. Exercises are simulations to test emergency operations plans and to identify improvements where necessary. These range from communications and system drills and facilitated discussions to functional and full-scale mock disasters. Exercises are planned and coordinated between emergency responders depending upon incident type and scope of the event. Emergency scenarios are developed and scaled to allow for demonstrating various or many EOP elements, and radiological emergency preparedness exercises are evaluated by state and federal agencies with strict criteria. They provide an opportunity to identify and integrate best practices. A key to all exercise activities is to evaluate decisions and actions to identify opportunities to improve plans and procedures, response resources, and potential training requirements, all with the goal of furthering a coordinated and effective response to the event being demonstrated. Next slide. Noted here is a list of recently completed or upcoming preparedness activities. New York State Office of Fire Prevention and Control, Westchester Department of Emergency Services, local fire departments, and EMS agencies met with Holtec to review response procedures and clarify appropriate context in March of this year. Holtec also conducted security drills in April. Full volume siren tests and emergency alert system tests are conducted quarterly, including in May and August of this year. Holtec and the Verplank Fire District conducted an annual drill in May. Enbridge Pipeline Safety and Incident Response conducted a briefing for local and county responders and Holtec in July. An Enbridge Pipeline tabletop was conducted earlier this month. The discussion-based exercise was facilitated by Enbridge and included participation from Holtec, state, county, and emergency responders in the area. And in November of this year, there will be an Indian Point Radiological Emergency Preparedness exercise, including participation from Holtec, Westchester, Rockland, Putnam, and Orange counties, as well as New York State agency partners, FEMA, and the NRC. Next slide. Not the least partner in preparedness, community members are essential response partners. It is vital for individuals to prepare themselves and their loved ones, and this includes learning about the hazards where we live, where we work, and where we go to school. Staying informed and getting involved as we are able. The 4 steps I feel, as part of my job, compelled to note here: building an emergency plan, building an emergency supplies kit, being aware, including signing up for emergency notifications, and getting involved before an emergency, where it will increase your ability to help where it is needed. To learn more about potential risks you can prepare for, the following resources noted here are recommended: FEMA's ready.gov, which has an amazing spectrum of resources. Westchester and New York State sites also have general preparedness information ranging from severe weather, storms, flooding, and snow. Westchester's site includes a specific area on Indian Point safety, where you can identify if you live within the emergency planning zone for Indian Point. You can access the Indian Point Emergency Guide with preparedness and response information and guidance. This specific resource is also mailed to community members within the 10-mile emergency planning zone, and this resource is also available in Spanish. Additionally, the Holtec site includes information to learn about preparing for a potential emergency relative to their facility, and Enbridge with information relative to pipelines and pipeline safety. It was noted earlier, but to more specifically emphasize, we encourage community members to sign up for notifications. Next slide. At Indian Point, the risk profile has changed significantly and will continue to change. There was a significant decrease once the fuel was completely removed from the reactors in 2020 and 2021. The risk continues to lessen as more fuel is cooled and transferred to the dry cast storage pad. Risk continues to decrease when all fuel is in dry cast storage, which Holtec projects for the 4th quarter of 2023. Proportionately, emergency operations plans and response requirements evolve with each new phase of decommissioning. Evacuation relative to a potential radiological event becomes increasingly unlikely. As relates to the pipeline, in May of 2021, New York State required enhanced mitigation measures via the joint proposal with Holtec. Additionally, Holtec and Enbridge signed an MOU in April of 2022 to enhance communications and pipeline crossing protocols with Enbridge. Next slide. The Holtec Fire Protection Plan was submitted to New York State for review in September of 2021. New York State requested additional information, including details regarding Holtec's preparedness for and responding to incidents involving interstate pipeline transmission pipelines. Westchester Department of Emergency Services and local fire departments also commented on the fire protection plan. New York State Office of Fire Prevention and Control, Westchester Department of Emergency Services, local fire departments and EMS agencies met with Holtec in March of 2022 to review response procedures and clarify appropriate contacts. Next slide. Holtec submitted an exemption request and license amendment request to the NRC. The submitted PDEP would decrease off-site emergency planning activities based on reduced risk profile, including the elimination of site area emergency and general emergency event classifications. It also proposes reducing the scope of off-site emergency planning. New York State opposes changes to the permanently defueled emergency plan until all fuel is on the pad. The NRC's decision on Holtec's exemption request is anticipated in January of 2023, and public comments may be sent directly to the NRC as noted here. Next slide. We conclude this briefing with the following key takeaways. With Indian Point's decommissioning, the radiological risk and potential for associated evacuation continue a steep decline. Emergency response entities plan, train, and exercise together for a spectrum of capabilities and hazards. The type of emergency and the actual or potential impacts will inform the decisions and actions taken. Public communications will be clear and direct when needed. Emergency preparedness guidance is available to the public via multiple mediums. And lastly, New York State has and continues to advocate for Holtec and the NRC to maintain strong on-site emergency preparedness. I'd like to thank my preparedness colleagues here with me this evening and express our appreciation to the members of the board and the members of the community to be able to present on this evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. That was a very thorough presentation. And want to also extend thanks to the whole team that contributed to that slide deck. I know members of the DOB understand there are going to be several questions during the public forum that will be applicable to what we just heard, but do any DOB members themselves have any questions for the presenters? Yes.
Kind of a fast one.
Could you please speak into the mic? I'm sorry. County Legislator Borgia. Go ahead.
Are you coordinating with other local police departments besides the Cortland and State Police, State and County Police, excuse me? Just because I know that we get a lot of information on Nixle. You know, every day you get, every tree that's down. It seems like it's a very efficient way of communicating with people.
I wouldn't want to speak on behalf of my Westchester partners other than to acknowledge a long history of county-wide coordination and the various partners. Obviously, this area is very integrated, but I don't know if they'd want to add.
So Susan, that's us?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
A quick
Yes.
question, because I live in the 10-mile radius. I've been getting a map every year of where I should go and what I should do. And we've had signs up in the community as to where to get the bus. Are all those things just thrown out in this process?
Thrown out? How do you mean?
I mean,
in what
in
process?
other words, we're going to
Yeah.
take down the signs for bus stops, and we're going to get rid of the maps and the schools that everybody goes to or doesn't go to. I mean, this is the practical thing. You know, and maybe that's discussed later on, but, you know, do we still do this?
I'm not aware of there being widespread changes to the plans as they stand now, but those would certainly be integrated into the longer-term conversations as the risk profile continues to evolve.
John, do you have anything?
Sure, I would just amplify. I would expect that as time goes by and as the spent fuel is migrated from the spent fuel pools and it all ends up in the dry cask storage, I would imagine at some time that, as I think Jennifer has said, that the risk profile will continue to decrease and get smaller, and there is likely going to be a time where, you know, the potential for evacuation would no longer be necessary when the risk is as, you know, close to zero as possible.
Does the county want to add anything, Susan?
We would just agree with that. I mean, it's part of the review of the PDEP, and you know, the state has made comments, and you know, it'll just be part of that review.
So, in sum, there's not a plan to throw it out, as you know, and there's not a schedule to throw it out, but there's a recognition that the decommissioning process will reduce risk at the site, and as Jennifer presented, there will likely be an evolution to the response plans. That being said, there's differences in opinion on how fast that evolution occurs, right? So the license amendment is in. There's a request to change it more rapidly than we would like to see, and I don't know if, Rich, you want to have any further comment on this at this time?
Sorry.
I've mentioned this before at other meetings. It's all dependent on the Zerk fire window, right? We are post-Zerk fire right now. So we would not, even at this point in time, meet the protective action guidelines that would require evacuation or shelter in place. The PDEP will then further allow us to modify our procedures. So technically, we still have a general emergency EIL classification, we still have a site area emergency classification, but from a science perspective, we're not going to even meet those points right now. And the PDEP formalizes that in January.
Okay.
And just, if I could take it one step further, you know, we had a facility in the state of New York that was at one point on its way towards licensure. That licensure did not ultimately come to fruition. One reason it did not come to fruition was there was concerns about the feasibility of the emergency evacuation plan. But that facility did not commercially operate. The fuel has been removed, and there is no longer a need for there to be an evacuation plan for that facility. And I'm talking about Shoreham.
Shoreham.
So that is the ultimate destination after everything is taken care of.
Thank you. Other questions from DOB members? Yes, Victoria?
So you mentioned that New York State is opposing any changes to the emergency preparedness plan until at least before all the fuel is moved into the dry cask storage. Could you elaborate a little bit on if you've had any discussions with the NRC about the exemption requests and your opposition?
John, you want to take that one? Or Elise? Start with John.
So it is correct that the state of New York has filed an opposition to the exemption request. NRC is reviewing that. They've provided the schedule when they anticipate a determination, which I think is February 2023. You know, in recent months, I am not aware of any bilateral dialogue with NRC about that. But I will check and report back.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions? Shall we move on to our next agenda item? I want to welcome Tina Vols-Bongar. Tina is known to many in the community. She has worked with United for Clean Energy, Resist Spectra, and is a climate reality leader. We're pleased to welcome you, Tina, to present today on the same topic, on emergency
Yes,
preparedness
thank you
and
so
response.
much. I'm so glad to be here, of course, and I do have a million questions for you, Jen Waka, but I guess I can, I'll address some of those during this. So anyway, I just wanted to add, my husband and I have lived for 18 years in Peekskill. We're really active in the community. We have a special events and live entertainment company. And that's who I am. I am a climate reality trained leader by Al Gore, which I'm proud to say. And he says, in the context of delivering bad news or harsh news, he said, I have some good news. We can do something about this. So that's part of the premise of some of the things that I'm going to mention tonight, hoping that if there's any question about that, that can be explained, or we can do something about it. So I have some essential questions. I'm going to show you why a lot of the community is concerned. I'm going to show you some federal regulations, just as they stand, to make sure, because the Enbridge representative is not here, unfortunately.
The Enbridge representative is here, John Sheridan.
Oh, you are?
He wasn't
Hi.
at the table when I did the introduction, so I apologize.
I'm glad to see you. Good. Okay,
John,
good.
welcome.
Sorry I missed you. I didn't know if you were in, if I missed your introduction. So anyway.
That's my fault.
And I submitted to the docket several months ago my top 10 emergency planning questions. And I was especially concerned about community members who need advocacy and support. 43.5% of our Peekskill population is Hispanic. And I really feel the need of seeing these emergency response plans in Spanish and distributed to the Hispanic community in Peekskill. And so obviously you're going to hear from me tonight about how I think community education and participation in a co-location emergency response plan between the plant and the pipeline is essential. So anyway, next slide. There's first essential question, which is, what is the emergency response plan of a co-location incident of the Algonquin pipelines and the decommissioning of the Indian Point site? Second slide.
Tina, we did start a bit early. If you want us to engage and go
The
back and forth during the slide presentation, we're happy to do that, but I defer to you on how you would like to handle it.
Yeah, I mean, since we have the opportunity to, question Enbridge about kind of their emergency response plans and what they are in a certain incident, and we have a first responder here, which is great. So I have questions on the first responder. So here is the second section. And thank you, Tom. And thank you for everything. And thank you for being so responsive to the community when it comes to this format and also the questions. All right. Much appreciated. And then this question, is the plan truly adequate? And what will New York State Decommissioning Board be able to do about it? That's my question. And you have been advocates. I see that you're being an advocate to the NRC, which we really appreciate. And obviously, Mr. Sipos, you think that community comment to the NRC and community pressure would be effective on the emergency preparedness exemption that.
So I'm going to, I think I heard a question there, and the short answer is yes. I think it is always good for host communities to express their views to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and to marshal the evidence that the community members think is appropriate and serve it up to the NRC. So short answer is yes.
Great. Okay. Next slide. And thank you, Tom Kazmarek, for being our production here. So this is what we're looking at. I just wanted to show you a map of how all this looks. We've got the 26-inch pipeline, which was put in the 50s, the 30-inch, which is 60. I think it's 1965, I'm not sure. And the 42-inch AIM pipeline, which became operational in 2017. And you can see how close, I circled it, which is the backup generator for battery storage for Indian Point, which is a huge concern to us, even in the transferring of the fuel rods. So at some point, the 26-inch and the 30-inch meet up with the high pressure during the thing, but it isn't at this site. We've got the older pipelines running underneath the plant, and they're even visible in one spot. I did a site visit. And so, anyway, this is why we're concerned. Next slide. This was a pipeline incident in Danville, Kentucky, from a 30-inch pipe. Just heard we have a 30-inch pipe on the site, and you can see the degree of fire from that. Next slide. I'm going to go to my notes, too. Time to go to my notes. This is, it resulted in 1 fatality and 6 injuries, and it was an evacuation of 75 people, and there was major fire damage. And a nearby railroad, we have a railroad, Metro North, too, and over 30 acres of land were burned. And the entire response was 81 firefighters, 10 engines, and 21 trucks. So there were 5 residences destroyed by the structure, by this fire. And that was within 1,100 feet from the rupture crater. So you can see from our pipeline, our high-pressure pipeline, if that were to go, it would impact the backup and electrical storage for Indian Point, which has been a major concern for us. And it makes me feel better that the Verplank fire person is here, Roberto, listening to this. Next slide. One of the other reasons I chose it was the National Transportation Safety Board, the NTSB, just issued a report on August 15th. And so it makes 3 recommendations to Enbridge and 3 to PHMSA, which is the Pipeline Hazardous Materials and Safety Administration, which is supposed to oversee all of this. And I'll talk about that in a minute. And then I'm asking at the end of this presentation for DPS to look at these recommendations and really layer it over this situation of the pipelines, and to see if there's any other steps that can be taken by Enbridge or Holtec to make it safer. And I'd like to say I'm so glad that this DPS was responsive to the Rick Kuperwitz recommendations and that those were incorporated into the memo of understanding. And I just want to say I did not know that until I was able to talk to Tom Condon yesterday. And so communication is always great, and I happen to be, I'd like to advocate for a community representative for this board. I think it would save you a lot of time. I really do. I think you could, with this community advocate, and sort of like the public advocate in New York City, which is that community members could come to this representative and ask these kinds of questions, and that one person would have them and know what was going on with the different agencies. So I just want to put that out there again. So anyway, next slide. And so this happened, and somebody called me and said, Tina, go to your second floor window, because I can see Indian Point from my second floor. Look, there's a fire at Indian Point. I was like, oh no. So anyway, we still have over 1,700 or maybe even 2,000 tons right now of irradiated fuel rods that are stored on site. And, I'm showing this photo because I want people to know in the community what to do in case of an emergency, and what to think about the pipeline, and know what kind of emergency response is going to go on, right? And I know about the general EOP, and that's great to hear again. But the question is does the EOP contain a coordinated response to both an incident, and we'll get to that because I have another question about that, but in a minute. Anyway, does it? So next slide. And these are some of the examples of the weather events that we're all very concerned about, the two 100-year hurricanes that we had, and especially in Sandy, where we almost got to Indian Point. Loss of power, earthquakes, especially, and that was a concern of the 2018 New York State risk assessment, which we don't know about. But anyway, they were concerned about the high-pressure pipeline, and anyway, looking at that. Another aspect that really concerns us is the cybersecurity threats and the hacking and ransom of the Colonial Pipeline. And we know Governor Hochul has a security initiative, a cybersecurity initiative that she's undertaking, and I'm hoping that this may be part of it, our little co-location. And of course, we're concerned about terrorism. We just had 9/11 and saw what happened with that. So we know, informally that Indian Point was a target then. We all know somebody who lost in 9/11. We don't want that to happen again. Next slide. And here are the emergency examples again, and the World Trade Centers were built to withstand the impact of jets, which they did, but not the extent of the burning jet fuel. It was something interesting that came out too about the foam, the firefighting foam that was used, whether or not that took too much oxygen and that helped for the place. Anyway, I just read about that and I thought it was interesting. So there was that. I just want to emphasize that risk assessments are very, very important here, and the extent and scope of them. And then there was the Uvalde school shootings where the chain of command really sort of broke down. But anyway, next slide. So how did we get here? I think that Dr. Courtney Williams covered that, some of those aspects very, very well in her presentation. But here we are, FERC approved the AIM pipeline next to Indian Point, much to a lot of us opposing it in the community. We were very grateful for the New York State Agency's risk assessment recommendations that were sent to FERC. We didn't see much response from FERC to that. But anyway, on to the NRC. And the NRC, as we all know, really let us down with the AIM pipelines. They used the Aloha model, which was incorrect. But the Office of Inspector General pointed out all of these aspects and said we should have a proper risk analysis. Then the NRC came back and covered their tracks a lot, we think, and said, no, that was mistaken. Everything's okay now. So what happened with our federal officials, and thank you to Mondaire Jones and Senator Gillibrand and Senator Schumer for advocating to PHMSA that we get this risk assessment. And PHMSA is doing that. I asked Senator Schumer's office for status on that, and we don't have one. So anyway, unfortunately. But whatever it is, I just want to make sure that I'm correct, Tom, about this, that DPS is going to be accountable for assessing this and making sure that the aspects of this are incorporated into the emergency response plan of the state.
So we will absolutely look at the recommendations and findings from that risk assessment, and if there are actions for the state to consider, obviously we will. But, it's too soon to say what they're going to find and what the recommendations will be. But as we've said sort of all along with the 2018 risk assessment that the state had conducted, there were findings and recommendations that we made to the feds. But we also made some findings for ourselves in terms of where DPS has authority, and that is what resulted in the audit of the control room of Enbridge in Houston, where we evaluated the time it would take for the remote valve closure.
And we just need to point out that that was from the point that it was reported. And a lot of these things take a long time to be reported, but, yeah, go ahead, sorry.
Right, no, that's fine. And, that information was, again, presented back to the feds. And the NRC in its IG report, asked the NRC to rerun a number of, the risk assessments that you cited, which they did do. So I'm not sure that, NRC said that its IG was mistaken. They did take the direction from the IG to go rerun risk assessments and did complete a technical assessment, a new technical assessment with a team that included a bunch of peer review. So much of what occurred with the NRC IG report and subsequent actions were also consistent with the 2018 report that the state had done and asked the feds to look into. So it was responsive to many of the concerns we had also raised. That is the IG report and the direction back to the NRC to rerun analyses.
Yeah, and so that would be a question that I will ask later about the EOC. The EOP, the New York State Emergency Response Plan, whether or not we have that information about an earthquake and what would be the impact on the newer AIM pipeline. So anyway, I just want to go back. I want to keep going, charge through this to my questions about emergency response of the public when something happens. There's an estimated 1,134 comments posted. I hope everybody's seen those to the DPS docket, asking Secretary Buttigieg and the New York State Public Service Commission Chair Roy Christian to issue a corrective action and shut off and purge the pipeline while we evaluate whether or not we really are safe here. And we have an emergency response plan that really comprehensively addresses an incident with both the pipeline and the plant. Next slide. Here's an issue for me, and I think Dr. Courtney Williams mentioned this, which is that each of these federal agencies sometimes work in their own silos. FEMA has put out a hazard mitigation plan. Westchester County did a great job in putting that together. I highly recommend everybody going on to the website and looking at it, and that's updated every 5 years. And so each municipality does an inventory of their emergency assets, like codes and infrastructure, which impact emergency response. The pipeline and also Indian Point are not included in this. And so it's of concern because it means that there's not really a coordinated response. And maybe you feel with the EOP and the Emergency Operational Plan like that, includes it, whatever. But for example, I learned that Peak Skills Police Station and Emergency Services Post, like the command center, doesn't have backup power. Only the Peekskill Middle School does. So my question would be, actually to Verplank, I hope that you have a mutual aid understanding or something like that can happen, because there isn't any emergency backup power, and we know that we would be needing that if we had an emergency. So that's just one aspect, and I feel like if we had these federal agencies working together, or in New York, and I know Susan Spear in Westchester County works with and everything, but there's just those kinds of questions, and the community in the meantime just doesn't know what's going on. So next slide. Experts have pointed to flaws in the Indian Point EPZ plan, and that was James Lee report, which was commissioned by Governor Pataki. We know that. The U.S. Government Accountability Office said the NRC needs to better understand likely public response to radiological incidents at nuclear power plants. And then there was these wonderful people from the Disaster Accountability Project, which surveyed all of these municipalities and asked about their Indian Point plan, and not any of these folks had one. So, next slide. Yes, I covered that. So it was the jurisdictions within the 10-mile radius versus the 50-mile radius. And their conclusion was that they don't have planning and they don't have evacuation plans. And anyway, next slide. So the 10-mile plan doesn't include structures and systems necessary to protect the public from radiation exposure. So that would really lean towards everybody doing an evacuation. That becomes an issue with sometimes when there's a gas emergency, and in the direction would be to shelter in place. That would be for other gas ruptures, vapor clouds, things like that. Also, the impact of the response of the 40-mile radius. You know, no one has really said, no one's been educated, just like what Sandy was saying, and I think Sandy gets a lot more material than I do. I'm very jealous. Like, I don't get anything about the, anyway, the bus stop and all of that. I mean, I'm lucky. I go down and every couple of years and get a booklet. So, but more so that these plans never really consider the reality and impacts of spontaneous evacuation and not just orchestrated plans. Like if something happened right now, I think all of us would be really concerned about where our loved ones were, how we contact them. And in these analyses, they found that this was the WIT report, that it was really parents and their children, getting their children from schools, who sort of messed up the plan the most, that orchestrated plan. So anyway, we really need to consider the reality now. We all use cell phones, and I'll tell you about that in a minute. Next slide. So this is a wonderful map that Manager Joe Green from Clearwater had, and it's of the emergency planning zone in Indian Point and the pipelines. So you can see that, anyway, it's kind of EPZ is bigger than we always think it is, and then the 50-mile radius includes the city. So anyway, next slide. So local authorities are supposed to, by federal regulations, to provide information for radiation and protective action, actions to us within the 10-mile zone. And I think you are the 10-mile zone, aren't you, Sandy? I am. You are, yeah, that's why you get all of that, right, okay. So that is inconsistent, and unfortunately, and I think that that's a reality that we would have the opportunity to address here with this plan. And so when it's really very frustrating when we talk about the finances and everything else, and we don't see any kind of public education about emergency response for these two major aspects. It's very upsetting. So next slide. AIM pipelines and Enbridge, and the federal emergency planning are requirements under the Code of Federal Regulations and not simply guidelines. And so I hope that the meeting in July was a great thing, good, everybody got together. But it's I believe it's a requirement that these first responders were trained in emergency response to a gas pipeline rupture. So anyway, next slide. Let's get to the meat and potatoes. So these are emergency plans, and each operator shall establish written procedures to minimize the hazards of a pipeline emergency. And so I have a question for our Enbridge representative. What would be the model that you are training the first responders with? Is it the Stanford plan, or is it from the pipeline safety awareness? They have training modules. I'm just wondering when and how that's been done.
John Sheridan with Enbridge. I'm not sure of the specifics, but Marlon Brown, who's our area supervisor, might be able to provide a little detail on that.
Sure. Yeah, come over here.
Thank you.
Yeah. That's my timer.
No, that's fine. That's okay. So my name is Marlon Brown. I'm an area manager with Enbridge. My area encompasses Southeast Compressor Station, and we would respond to Indian Point in case of emergency, together with the other area, South Plainfield. So you asked about training procedures?
Yeah, the training modules. whether or not it's a Stanford plan or what the training module is for first responders. Words from the Pipeline Safety Awareness Group.
So Enbridge does not provide training materials for emergency responders. What we do is we have liaison meetings. We invite emergency personnel to our facilities to take a tour. And during those liaison meetings, there's a presentation that talks about what you should and what you shouldn't do, but we don't specifically provide any training to emergency responders.
Specifically, training materials.
Training
Sounds
materials,
like
yep.
they're...
There's training, yes, but not training materials, yes.
Okay, so there's just a disconnect here. I'm sorry, there's a disconnect here because we are obviously looking that written procedures should be for a pipeline emergency. And so that would be a question that I have for DPS and my federal electeds and everybody else to address. That is something that comes up in the it will come up in the analysis of the incident in Kentucky with the 30-inch pipe. So I'm not going to ask you, Mr. Sipos, how this is enforced. But obviously, this is not being followed and goes to my very, very first question, which is how are first responders being trained?
Tina, could I just ask a further question of Enbridge here? This emergency plan that is being cited here is the written procedures are written procedures that the company must maintain. Do you want to speak, right, do you want to speak to the whether or not the company is maintaining the written procedures that is being cited here on this slide?
Marlon Brown again from Enbridge. So we have written procedures for ourselves and for our personnel. So we have procedures that, God forbid, in case of emergency, that we do follow. But those procedures are not given to anyone else.
Does PHMSA inspect your written procedures?
I am not sure. I wouldn't, and I don't want to guess on that.
I think ARPA Meta is from our gas safety team, from a regulatory standpoint, may be on virtually. ARPIT, do you want to opine here at all? Any further observations with respect to PHMSA's oversight of these written procedures?
Yes, I can say that PHMSA does review inspects the written procedures as part of their standard inspections, and so do their state partners that have an interstate agreement.
Could I ask a question?
Thank you.
Tom?
Yes, Assemblywoman Gala.
Are our local people being trained? Have you had training at all? Have you been called to go to a training session anywhere?
So recently, we've worked with Enbridge in the county, Westchester County, on an event if something did happen to an Enbridge pipeline. But that's all variables on where it is, what's around it, is there pressure still coming out of it. They did touch, further on about what they could provide us in that incident. But like I said, it's all variables. It could change anytime, whether it's down by the river, down by, in a wooded area with brush, drought. It's a variable. It changes day by day.
Do you feel competent that you can take care of a situation?
Yeah, I would say we're pretty confident of what we could do, if something like that happened. We have many assets to either operate on the water or in a wooded area, along with our help from Westchester County and our neighboring departments. But as far as feeling confident, I feel like we're pretty confident.
Okay.
Yes, please.
Thank you. So thank you so much, Chief. We really appreciate that. So Westchester County facilitated with Enbridge's content and participation from the state, county, and local levels. First, in July, a safety briefing. That was an online briefing. We invited local first responders, local fire departments, law enforcement, EMS agencies, and also state agencies and county agencies to do basic safety briefing that Enbridge provided.
Could Susan please speak up? We can't hear her.
Sure. As step 2, after that safety briefing, the county again facilitated with Enbridge doing the content, a tabletop exercise, which again included, hosted by Chief Rosario, included local first. Oh, sorry.
Okay.
Could you?
Included local.
Okay, so yeah, we're going to get time, and so what you're really saying is that we haven't had a comprehensive training of first responders, but we are trying to with these meetings.
Well, I would disagree with that slightly. I think that, you know, we had an excellent discussion. We were presented with a scenario. It was in fact a co-incident scenario with a pipeline rupture and impacting Indian Point, where we discussed all the things that you, I believe, would want us to discuss, such as, you know, who's the incident commander, you know, where is the incident command post, how, you know, what happens as the event unfolds,
Okay.
who responds, in what succession, how do people know how to respond, who knows how to respond. I mean, we went through all those steps as part of the tabletop, and I think that was a very comprehensive review that did a good job preparing local first responders.
First responders, but it's not a requirement. It's not a requirement for all first responders to know what to do in the case of this emergency. Just saying, you know, and that might be great moving forward, is for each first responder and each unit, for instance, ours in Peekskill, where we know we don't have any backup power from our stations. So that's what I'm talking about. Susan. All right, so I'm going to have to cut this short. Next slide.
Well, we believe
Tina,
it's
we have
essential.
time.
I just want to say
Well, you
that.
have time.
Okay.
You don't have to cut short.
Whatever the requirement, Westchester County believes it's essential. So we facilitated it with the cooperation of Enbridge and all the local first responder agencies, who were very anxious, by the way, to participate. In
Good.
fact, Enbridge, I think,
I
made
bet.
the comment during the tabletop that they had never seen such a good turnout by a broad spectrum of first responders.
That's wonderful. That's great. That takes a lot of advocacy. And so, next slide. This is, so it's coordinating planned responses and actual responses during number, it's A number 8. And that's what this sounds like to me. But I'm glad to know that was comprehensive, and maybe moving forward, we can know that this is being done more robustly. And it's furnishes supervisors who are responsible for emergency, actually a copy of that the latest edition of emergency procedures. It'd be great for them to know what the module is and what the mode of emergency procedures are. And that might come up in looking at this incident of the pipeline, the 30-inch pipeline in Kentucky that Enbridge has. So next slide. And learn the responsibilities, identify the gas pipeline, plan how the operator can engage in mutual assistance to minimize hazards, life, or property. And so those are the regulations, and that should be done. Next slide. So this is what we have. And a lot of people who live near the pipeline get a emergency response guidelines. And then we have the Indian Point Emergency Guide. Some of those instructions contradict each other. And I think this one doesn't have the slides, unfortunately. And that's about evacuating in place and also leaving. So, I mean, sheltering in place and then leaving. So next slide. So there are differences, and this is what the questions are. There are differences in the emergency protocols between a gas pipeline rupture and a radiological emergency. And so the question is, Susan, who will make the decisions and which protocols to follow? And how will the community know the difference between a rupture and a radiological release? and which set of protocols we should. We've been told not to use our cell phones with the gas emergency in case of igniting a fire by some of the pipes that are in the area, right? And anyway, how is that going to be done?
Okay, so in general, it's going to depend on how the incident unfolds. So let's take a couple of scenarios, maybe to illustrate. So let's say there is a rupture of the gas pipeline and a fire results. First thing that's going to happen, somebody's going to call 911. Also simultaneous to that, or soon after that, Enbridge is going to notice a pressure drop in their pipeline. So when 911 is called, there's going to be, the first dispatch is going to be, well, it depends where the rupture is in the pipeline, but let's say it's in Verplank. Chief Rosario is going to get a call. Verplank is going to be dispatched. Given the nature of the fire in this kind of situation, you would expect it to be a large incident. Therefore, mutual aid is going to kick in as well, and there will be several area fire departments that will be also dispatched as well. Chief Rosario will be the incident commander at that point, and he will make the decision as to calling out mutual aid. In addition, he's most likely going to call for the county hazmat team,
Okay.
which is in place and ready to be dispatched at Chief Rosario incident commander's call. So,
And how will the public be notified of what kind of emergency this is?
So
From
most
whom?
likely, at that point, there's going to be law enforcement on the scene, as well as a good contingent of fire and EMS. They will actually go door to, if the chief decides that an evacuation is necessary, or it is a large incident where people need to be notified in some way to take some action, shelter in place, or evacuate, law enforcement, with the help of fire department, will go literally door to door, knocking on doors to tell people what to do. And then depending on the situation and how the incident unfolds, there's a series of other notifications that could happen. The ones that Jen Waka indicated before, the WIAs, all those alerts, I won't list them again, but they're all there in the materials, will occur depending on the level of the event. Now, if we should then get into a point where somehow Holtec is impacted and there is an emergency alert, which is a radiological alert, if that should happen, then the county would step in with a decision about the radiological impact and whether additional evacuations would be necessary based on the radiological impact.
Mm-hmm.
And then the county executive at that point, along with the state, becomes the radiological incident commander and makes the decisions about the radiological aspects. And
Okay.
also most likely,
It makes
I
the
should
decisions
say-
about the gas pipeline and how close it is to the gas pipeline and if there'll be fires and that
And I
kind
also
of-
want to say there will also most likely be a unified command structure set up close but not too proximal to the event in order to have all the people that are making decisions in the same place at the same time talking to each other. We have an excellent interoperable radio system where folks can speak to each other. The county just spent a ton of money on that. Very proud of it. Thank you, Councilman Borgia. And sorry, I didn't mean to make light. I feel like the answer to your question is going to depend on how the incident unfolds, but we can talk about different scenarios, and I feel very confident that we all know who's in command and what to do if and when an incident should unfold. And if you have
Right.
questions about types of incidents and how that would unfold, we'll be happy to answer.
Right, and you know my concern. And so my concern is about the vulnerable people in our community. I have a 99-year-old mother. She can see Indian Point from her window. You can pick her up on the way to the bus stop. She's still a very active and vital person. And so I really feel that we have not sufficiently, all of our government agencies, reached out to our Hispanic community, our disadvantaged communities. I'm a Democratic Party district leader in public housing, and so I happen to ask everybody. I was like, okay, we're going to have to get everybody a guide because this has never been addressed in the Peekskill Housing Authority. So I just want everybody to be aware of the fact that, and I haven't gotten the information that Sandy has. So, anyway.
Well, thank you for your community activism. It's deeply appreciated by those of us who try to make these plans effective every day. We do work, in fact, Dennis Delborgo serves on the committee to address with the disabilities, so he talks to them every day. He can speak to that if that would be helpful. Nobody is saying that an evacuation isn't without challenges. It's with huge, overwhelming challenges.
Right.
But that is why we plan, and we have plans that are evolving to try to address all those challenges. Will it be deeply disruptive and awful? Yes. But that's why we have, as much as we can plan for, we plan for, whether it's language barrier, physical disability, communications, all of those things are taken into consideration. We plan as best we can, but nobody's under any illusion that it won't be with deep, distressing challenges.
Yeah, and it's hard not to look at the money in the decommissioning and look at that for emergency evacuation and just what you're talking about, and not say, you know, this could actually be done on a comprehensive level, which is educating people about effective emergency responses, which would be helpful in any kind of an emergency.
Yes, absolutely.
And so the question is like, why can't we coordinate our government agencies? Because we're able to do that when we're talking about, you know, energy infrastructure and the needs and everything of energy infrastructure. But when we get to public safety, I feel that there's a real disconnect. Anyway, that's just opinion.
Tina,
Next slide.
Could I just stay on this point for a
Yeah.
minute? And I think we're running on schedule. I want to get to your questions, so don't worry about the 7:30 deadline. We're gonna move in.
Okay,
into
great.
it.
Okay,
You had
good.
many of the questions that were part of the public forum, so it's
Okay.
But I
So-
wanted to ask Dave Lockbaum if he's on and could just speak to a key point that he made in our very first Decommissioning Oversight Board meeting, related to the types of radiological releases that could occur at this stage of decommissioning and where we're at.
Okay, great.
So Dave, could you just go over that relative risk profile of the site, the points that you made on at the very first Decommissioning Oversight Board meeting?
Sure, Tom. And Rich and Jennifer have kind of spoken to that point as well. Because of the radioactive decay of, for example, iodine-131, which is the reason potassium iodide is recommended for operating plants, that's basically decayed away. That's no longer a threat from any scenario, even sabotage at Indian Point. That's not to mean that the risk is zero. It's just significantly reduced from what it was when the plant was operating, or the first few months after the plant permanently shut down. But it is significantly reduced. There are a few scenarios that are still concerned. So that's why I was encouraged to hear about the tabletop, the natural gas and so on, because even though it's reduced, it's not zero, and it's still prudent to have plans in place.
Yeah, we saw the jets go into the World Trade Center.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dave. Sorry, Tina.
Sorry, that's okay.
Turn back to your question.
And so how will the public know whether to evacuate or shelter in place? Is it going to be from somebody knocking on my door? And we have 20,000 people in Peekskill, and we're assuming that they can speak to our 43.5% Hispanic population who do speak English, but who are going to be bilingual. Okay. Okay, you know what I'm saying, and I know there are holes, and I could go into the holes, and I don't need to go there. So next slide. Thank you, Tom. So how the public will know not to use their cell phones or cars in case of a gas rupture emergency. Our Enbridge representative, do you have any experience with this?
This is John Sheridan. Marlon, I think you might have a little bit more knowledge on that topic, if you could elaborate. Thank you.
Marlon Brown again from Enbridge.
Right into the mic, please.
Yep.
Thanks.
Marlon Brown again from Enbridge. So the question was asked, how would you know whether to use a cell phone or not? We do have specific wording in our brochures that tell you Of course, don't use your cell phone or don't use any source of ignition during a gas release. So let's just picture like your stove. For those of you who have a gas stove, gas emits, you have an ignition, and you have flame on your stove. It could be the same way if you have a big source of ignition. But what you have to take in mind, what you have to remember is the amount of gas in air is what causes that explosion. So, or causing that combustion. So there's no specific guideline to say, I can't tell you, don't use your phone when there's X amount of gas, but common knowledge should tell you don't start your car, don't have any source of ignition if you smell natural gas, or have a big smell of natural gas.
And are they going to smell the 42-inch gas pipeline? They're not going to smell that. Is there odorant in the transmission pipeline?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, there's odorant. The pipelines, when they're put in service, they go through a process called pickling, which we put odorant in the line to pickle the line, or to make the line full of odorant, and then the gas itself is odorized. So if you don't get that smell of gas, you don't get that McCaptain, you don't have gas in your area, most likely.
I've heard otherwise. We have different Enbridge or Spectra representatives in the past.
Arpit, do you want to weigh in on the odorant requirements of the pipeline system?
Yes, so that's a transmission pipeline. So if they do, in that, I'll have to refresh my memory, but I believe in that class location, they're generally odorized to 10% of the lower explosive limit.
We have odorant detectors that would pick up on if the odorant is low or if it's high.
Okay, thank you. Tina, you want to go back to your questions?
Yeah. And so there's obviously a big difference between the transmission pipelines and then the delivery pipelines. And so that is a really good question about the 40-inch, just based on what Spectra told us when they were getting their project approved in our neighborhood. So sort of answered the 7. And what kind of monitoring is in place for gas release ruptures and radiological releases?
I think this is also Enbridge.
Yes, I can respond to that. This is John Sheridan. We have transmitters at valve sites. We also have gas control.
Microphone. Yeah, directly into the mic.
I'm sorry. We have transmitters at valve sites. We also have gas control that monitors the system 24/7. It can remotely manipulate those valves. So we have a system in place that monitors any type of gas releases.
And it's my understanding that sometimes at the very beginning of that release that registers, sometimes the pressure in the pipeline increases to make up for that difference automatically. So it tries to normalize itself by the indication that there's a problem in the delivery system. Does that make sense?
I'm not aware of that.
You get more gas if it's leaking somewhere. Okay.
Come on back up. Thank you.
So there's no mechanism to put more gas into the line. The way the gas moves, it's compressed, and it moves down the line from one compressor station to the next. So if there's a lower detection of gas somewhere, it's not going to try to make up for that.
Does it increase compression?
No, ma'am.
Maintain pressure in the line?
No, ma'am. The only way that happens is for a gas control to actually put another unit on to pull that gas faster. That gas, there's nothing to tell the gas it has to move faster or we need more, unless that's a command from gas control.
The question also asks about radiological releases. Did you want Rich Baroni to talk about monitoring on the radiological side as well?
Yes.
Yeah, so we have the Reuters-Stokes monitors that are outside the perimeter of the plant. So we've talked about that at previous meetings. There's 16 Reuters-Stokes monitors that we maintain. Also, we have our in-house radiation monitors that monitor for effluent releases. So those are all still in service.
And Mr. Brody, have your workers on site been trained in the emergency response to the gas pipeline?
Trained in what? I'm sorry?
Besides these, have they been trained about the appropriate response to an emergency with the 2 pipelines on the
Sure.
site?
So our protocol requires the control room operator to do 2 things. One, he'll contact the county through what's called a Part 1 form or direct conversation. And then he'll also make sure if there's a radiological release or a radiological event, he'll put corrective actions in place to address that. Then once the county is notified and we need the fire department, our security force and our health physics people will meet the fire department at the gate and
Okay.
escort them to the rupture itself.
Okay, to the rupture itself. Okay, but, so are all of your workers trained in the appropriate gas responses, like not to use their cell phones, not to?
No, our control room operators are the ones that are basically trained to address any event. We haven't really discussed the use of cell phones.
And radios, the county radio system. Okay, with a potential vapor cloud, what would be the impact to the fuel rods and the casks and/or canisters, and what would be the result? We saw the fire.
I'm sorry, I'm still stuck on the previous Q&A. If I could just
Yes,
ask
go ahead.
Rich some basic safety messages to staff about the smell of gas and not to use ignition sources would seem like a prudent message out to employees.
To me, it would be common sense.
It may be for most, but a message to just remind folks on not using ignition sources if there's a smell of gas on site.
Exactly. I mean, if plant personnel were to smell gas on site, they would contact the control room immediately, right? And then the control room would send out an operator to do an investigation.
I understand that. I'm just suggesting that it may be worthwhile to have a communication to staff, all folks, all personnel on the property, as a safety reminder, common sense reminder that if you smell gas,
Don't
yes,
start your
go-
car.
right?
Don't drive off
Don't
the
use ignition
premises. Don't
sources.
call your loved ones. Don't use that cell phone. Don't check the cell phone for any kind of emergency messages. Like, those things seem to me to be very, very important when we have a co-location site with these fuel rods and the pipelines. So,
I'm sorry, Tina, you can go back to your
okay.
question.
And so with a potential vapor cloud at Indian Point, so let's say we really get the 30-inch, it ruptures and we see what happens. What would be the impact to the fuel rods and the casks or the canisters? And what would be the result?
So there's a regulatory guide 1.91 that provides the guidance to evaluate the effects of an explosion on site. And so using that as a reference, we had an independent contractor evaluate the effects of the gas line explosions to the fuel. So if you look at the 42-inch line, we have a formal report that states the pipeline is located over 1,500 feet from the SOCA boundary, which is the security owner-controlled area. So no damage to any safety or system components within the protected area is postulated or credible, based largely on the substantial separation distance from the 42-inch line. So that's the 42-inch line. From the 26 and 30-inch line, the report does conclude that there's a 1 in 10 million chance per year of some damage to the IP3 fuel storage building. But just so you know, just so we realize, the fuel itself is, and that damage would be above grade to the fuel storage building itself. The fuel itself is below grade, captured under 23 feet of water. So we don't see any effect to the fuel itself either.
Okay, so and then when it's lifted out of the water and it's there on the CPAD, what would be the result there?
So as we transfer fuel to the asphyxia pad, there's even less of an effect.
Okay, but less of an effect, but we still don't know what that
Zero
impact
effect.
would be. Zero effect.
Yeah.
So you think that those casks would just be, everything would be fine?
Absolutely.
Dave Lockbaum, our technical expert, may also want to weigh in on this question. Dave, are you on?
Yeah, I agree with Rich on that one, because the casks are also designed for, like a high winds propelling a telephone pole, a javelin, into the side of the canister, and they're designed, which would be a more stressful or more forceful impact than from a vapor cloud explosion. So I agree with Rich. The science supports that notion.
Okay. So the next slide. And I want to thank DPS again for taking the recommendations of Rick Cooperwitz. And so I've just replaced that ask with this ask. And I'm wondering if you'll look at the recommendations of the NTSB in Danville, Kentucky, gas line rupture, and make sure that recommendations are being applied to the AIM pipeline emergency protocols.
Thank you, Tina.
And
Again, I'm going to
that would be the next time you see me.
Well, that's okay, but I have a short answer here. Arpit, our gas safety expert, is on. Arpit, do you want to speak to this?
Yes, we're reviewing the NTSB recommendations from the Danville, Kentucky Incident Report, and we'll work with PHMSA to verify the operator is complying with those recommendations.
Okay, great. And does anybody here know about the PHMSA risk assessment? What the status is on that?
We do not yet have a date for release.
Okay, great, thank you.
Not that we haven't asked.
Okay.
We've been asking.
Thank you so much for letting me present and present longer, and I really appreciate that.
We appreciate it.
Tom, may I make
yeah,
one more
sure,
comment?
Susan.
Thank you. I thought your presentation was excellent. Thank you. I did want to address the question about the hazard mitigation plan, because I feel a very personal connection with that plan. So I just want to mention what the plan is and isn't. The hazard mitigation plan is a prerequisite that FEMA requires in order for the county or municipalities to apply for grant funding for mitigation projects. So think, primarily in this area like flooding. So retaining walls, lifting your home up above the floodplain, stream dredging, those kind of things. So it does have a section on chemical, radiological, biological hazards, but that is really more of a risk assessment piece than a mitigation piece, because there's not a whole lot of mitigation projects we could apply for federal funding for mitigation regarding the plant or the pipeline. So we do have numerous plans that deal with Indian Point and the gas pipeline, and there are a variety of plans. I can list them for you if you'd like, but the hazard mitigation plan is not really designed for that purpose. It's designed for projects that will be eligible for federal funding for mitigation grant funding.
Okay, so it's not on any coordinated thing. And it was amazing to see in the New York State risk assessment that 17 hazardous waste facilities were identified in the PRI, so that PRIR is the potential impact radius, and I only know of 9. And we had the wonderful report from Clearwater about the environmental justice community of Peekskill and how many of these things that we have, but nowhere have we really seen that kind of hazardous waste or what would be impacted when we have some sort of emergency. So anyway, just so you know, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I believe Dave Lockbaum may have had his hand up virtually. Dave?
Yeah, this is Dave Lockbaum. Tina raised a good point about the transformer fire. Had a slide showing the smoke arising from that fire. I looked at that event quite extensively, but I didn't look at her other point about the proximity of the backup power substation to the 42-inch pipeline. But a lot of the documents for the transformer fire will answer the substation, and I don't even know what that answer is, but I'll look at those documents and report back on what I find.
Thank you, Dave. Okay, at this point, I'd like to go to the next slide, please, and we're going to begin the public forum. We have with us again Tony Belcito, an administrative law judge from the Department of Public Service, who's going to run the public forum for us. Thank you very much, Tony.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Just to remind everyone, the public forum will be organized by topic areas. We're going to focus on pre-submitted questions, which I will read out loud for the DOB members and guest panelists to respond. And then the questioners will be afforded an opportunity to reply or request further clarification. In order to afford all individuals an opportunity for their questions to be heard, the moderator, myself, may ask that some discussions be paused until future meetings. Time permitting, additional questions that we received over the last week will be addressed. The public forum will conclude actually at 8:15 because following this we will have a presentation by Mr. Turo from DEC. We want to get that started on time. Questions not addressed during this meeting will be answered in writing. So the first topic is planning and preparation. And the questioners are John Sullivan, Courtney Williams, and Susan Leifer. The first question is, in an emergency, who will be in charge?
Susan, you want to take that?
Sure. So again, it depends on the nature of the emergency. If you think about what Jennifer Waka said earlier, incidents really start and end locally. So most likely the first person who's going to be in charge is Chief Rosario. He can certainly add to it, but that might evolve as the incident evolves and changes.
Chief, you have anything to add?
No, she pretty much hit the nail on the head with that one. It's going to be, contingent to, what the scenario is, whether it be something as small as a minor leak from a pipeline, something to do with Holtec. It's all going to have different variables. So it really depends on what the scenario is at that time.
Thank you.
So if it's purely a radiological event, then the county, in conjunction with the state, will be in charge. It's a fire-related event. It's going to be the local fire department with mutual aid backup and hazmat backup from the county.
Thank you. Will DPS and the DOB be advocating for leaving robust emergency planning in place for as long as the irradiated spent fuel is co-located with the Algonquin pipeline system?
Start with Elise. You want to take the first crack at this question?
So New York State has, in previous filings with NRC over the last few years, has stated clearly and in detail our position, as stated earlier in this meeting today, that we oppose any reduction in emergency preparedness plans and measures prior to all fuel being put into dry cask storage. That remains our position, and we expect to be reiterating that to NRC in the proceeding for the PDEP that is currently ongoing.
And once it's all in dry cask, then what?
Could the speaker please identify yourself?
Sorry, I'm Courtney Williams, the
Okay.
person, that's why I came up.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank
Who
you.
asked the question.
Sorry.
So I think you said as long as, once everything's in dry, until everything's in dry cask. And so but my question was, as long as the fuel is there at the site.
Right.
So after it's in the dry cask,
Yes.
what emergency preparedness, sirens, et cetera, will be in place?
Right. So the state's comments that have been submitted have taken the position that we oppose their waiver request until the fuel is on the pad, right? And what we've heard from the various technical assessments that have been put out subsequent to the IG report, as well as our own technical expert here, is that at that time, the risk of any kind of issues associated with a radiological release, even associated with a pipeline rupture, are low enough to allow for an evolution of the emergency preparedness and response plans that we've been discussing up here. I mean, I think we've answered that question as to, you know, the impacts. Dave Lockbaum mentioned it, but that's the rationale, that's the scientific basis for why we would take such a position.
And just another follow-up to that, which is right now, as far as I can tell, the ISFISI, like the idea is that you're moving it all there and then it's going to be moved away. If the plan had been to store it there forever, what would be different about like how you stored it there and what planning would need to take place for safety? Because I think most rational folks think it's like a total delusion that that fuel is ever going to be transported to some non-existent storage facility that would require a change to federal law, et cetera.
Question, Rich Brony, do you want to take that, or John Sipos, or both?
Yeah, sure. So the fuel itself, or the casks themselves, would go under the aging management program. I think we had that discussion, right?
Right, like there's no way to monitor, because if you
Right.
did,
And
then that
so
could
that's
make
what we
it
would
more
do
dangerous.
until DOE takes ownership of the casks themselves. I mean,
So DOE will take ownership of it and leave it there?
well, hopefully DOE will take ownership and eventually go to a repository.
Right, but the question is
Is like if it's not actually- if
You're
it-
assuming in the question that that never comes to pass.
Right.
And so what happens on site if it's stored there
Like how
in
does what
perpetuity?
is happening on the ISFISI pad compare to Holtec's long-term interim storage stuff? Like is it just bowling pin, like it is here, bowling pins lined up in the New Mexico desert? Or is
No,
it
it's
something
actually
more
a
secure?
It's actually a different configuration in that repository in New Mexico. They are buried underground with a cooling system.
But we don't
For
get that
longer term.
here, even if DOE never takes ownership and then pays Holtec to take back ownership, but at the site in New Mexico.
Correct.
I think it's a challenging question because it's a hypothetical. I mean, I think over the next decades, if we were to get to that place and it was prohibited from taking fuel off-site and that had to stay there in perpetuity, there would then have to be a new plan on-site to maintain the integrity of the fuel.
But as I understand
Well,
it, there's
the
no
only way I
way.
can answer is with the aging management program. I wish I could give you an answer that's what's going to happen 60 to 100 years from now. I just can't. All I can tell you is that we'll implement the aging management program. It looks for any of the deficiencies to the multi-purpose canister and the high storm itself. And then we'll make corrections and we'll bring it back to NRC regulations as required.
I would just argue, isn't the hypothetical that the fuel could be moved? Because it's not possible to move it right now, right? There's nowhere to send it, and interim storage is not technically legal, right? The federal law hasn't changed yet. So the hypothetical here is that it will ever leave and not that it will remain.
Right.
So, but we're planning that the hypothetical is really going to happen, and my question is the hypothetical situation.
Your skepticism is fair, okay? DOE was here in July. They met with all of us. That meeting is available on our website.
I was remote for it, yeah.
I'm sorry, you were? Okay, great, yeah. So you know that they are, in fact, doing the work to plan for the eventual shipment of the fuel to interim sites.
Could I just ask
Sorry,
a question
yes.
about that? So regardless of whether or not that happens in the time frame that happens in, we feel pretty certain that the storage is going to be here for a decent amount of time. So what's the tipping point where you say, oh, maybe we need a more robust long-term plan? Like, how do you decide that you're at that tipping point?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, even if you say, oh, yes, eventually in 100 years, it's going to be someplace else. Where does it, because we can't just keep saying, we think it's going to happen, we think it's going to happen, we think it's going to happen. And I think to that point of, we don't know what's going to happen in 100 years, certainly none of us will be here in 100 years, and maybe there should be a little bit more forethought about that.
Yeah, fair. John, you want to?
So I think there's actually a lot of sub-questions in what you've been proposing and what this discussion has been. So I want to just come back to the question that's up on the screen right now for just one moment. It's based on the assumption that it's depending on this concept of co-location, and I think we have discussed this in the past. Co-location may mean different things to different people, but I think there was a colloquy with Mr. Baroni a few meetings ago. The dry cask site at Indian Point is at a location that is perhaps the farthest away from any of the legacy gas lines or the AIM segment. So I want to just get that out there, right, just sort of the level set that it is in a location that is far away, or relatively farthest away from any other place on the site. So that's just the first thing. Second, there is a difference between spent fuel storage, wet storage, and dry cask storage. And the idea that the NRC has thus far accepted is that dry cask storage provides a passive system. The fuel is disaggregated coming out of the spent fuel pools, and it's dispersed across various casks. And those casks, and I know you've walked around and you've seen this, the idea behind these casks is that they are passive. And they contain small, relatively smaller amounts than exist in the pool on a disaggregated basis. I guess lastly, I would say the federal government has not, to the point about the skepticism that I think, that we have discussed right here about the Department of Energy. Yes, there is skepticism. Is there a basis for this skepticism? There's 50 years of basis for that skepticism. So I hear that, but I want to put that question, from what Mr. Baroni said and everyone else has said in context. I don't know that the assumption that it's co-located is like necessarily
I would grant
way to
you
look at it.
we could still be concerned and want safety planning, even if this wasn't the smallest nuclear plant in the country, even if it wasn't the only one with multiple or any gas transmission pipelines crisscrossing it, and on fault lines, et cetera, even if we said forget all of those, I think we would still want the emergency planning to be in place as long as there's radiation at the site.
I think Dave Lockbaum had his hand up, and then we need to move on to the next question. Dave?
Yeah, this is Dave Lockbaum. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission's regulations certify a dry cask for 20 years and allows up to 4 20-year extensions to the original certification. When the original casks were loaded in 1986 and certified, there were no aging management programs required. That came about in 2006 as those initial casks were being recertified. The NRC imposed that as a requirement to address degradation. As the subsequent certifications come up, if the conditions are deteriorating, they need more security, they need more inspections, they need more whatever, the recertification process is the way the NRC would impose that requirement on the owners. So it's not the save all, but it is some protection against the public, against what happens in the future.
Thanks,
Just for
Dave.
clarification.
Rich?
The first cask fuel in 2004, not in 1986, so.
I think he was referring to not at Indian Point.
I just want to make sure we're clear on that.
Yeah, Surrey was the first plant in the United States, and that was 1986.
Okay.
Back to you, Tony.
Thank you. Is Holtec using the survey sent out last year for emergency planning? If so, what have they done to correct deficiencies in the survey, i.e. reach people who don't have computers, speak Spanish, or reach Spanish language speakers and speakers of indigenous languages that make up a large portion of those in the 10-mile radius?
Rich, that's to you.
Yeah, I know. Let's talk offline on this, because the only survey that I'm familiar with was an evacuation time survey. So I don't know if you're talking about a different one.
It's the postcard that we all got in the mail that had like the QR code and asked questions like, will you evacuate yourself by car? Is your college student, is your kid going to be away at college, or are they going to be home and need for you to take them?
Yeah, let me review the survey again. I think that was just to develop the evacuation time estimate. That's what the intent of that survey was. So if we couldn't get through to Spanish-speaking people with it, that could be a concern. So let me look into that.
Yeah, my worry is that, most folks don't know what a QR code is. And that it was only in English when a huge proportion of Peekskill and Ossining and others in the 10-mile evacuation radius would not be able to take that. Folks who are elderly would not be taking that survey because they don't use a QR code. So it's like inherently leaving out the people most likely to need help evacuating and shouldn't be used to do any kind of planning, because it seemed designed to exclude the folks that would slow down evacuation.
I don't want to believe that was the intent, but I understand what you're saying. So let me look at it, and then we can make corrections as necessary.
Thank you.
Thanks, Courtney.
Can I just, I'm John Sullivan, and so you did mention my name. So I just want to, the issue, thank you, Susan. The issue isn't so much who's in charge, but is there redundancy? What happens when things fall apart? Are you guys planning for that? Is that part of the tabletop exercise? So I also want to thank the DOB for the website, so that's really great. And just one more thing, is the county interested in putting stuff out on TV, on Channel 12, explaining what shelter in place is and how that's going to be applied? So, okay, thank you.
All right, so this is Susan Spear. So what happens if things should fall apart, and have we built redundancies? So yes, we have redundancies, and I think, we've always really thought about a unified command structure if there was to be an incident where you'd have representatives of the different responders. So you'd have the fire representative, you'd have an EMS representative, you'd have the hazmat team leader, you'd have, the different types of responders would be in one central location to be able to make decisions and have redundancy built in. In addition, depending on the scale of the incident, we would probably step up the Emergency Operations Center and again have a tremendous amount of redundancy and bring all the players into one place so decisions can be made with all the information. Basically we need sufficient information to make a good decision, and then we need the resources to back up that decision, and I think we have all that in place. Channel 12, sure, yeah.
Could I just, on that, I do think that that's a very good idea, actually, to not only broadcast it among our media outlets, but also just to have it, on our website so people can look at it and review it. So.
Good. Thanks, John.
Thank you. At Indian Point, what and who is in place in the event of an incident caused by human error, failure of equipment, natural disaster, or malicious acts to either the Enbridge gas lines or decommissioning of Indian Point with Holtec?
So shall we start on this one with John?
Sure. The Algonquin pipeline system has sensors on the system that can detect gas releases or any other issues. In the event that something does occur or happen, we certainly will reach out to first responders immediately to notify them. We also have employees that work and live in the area, and they can respond. They're on call, and they can respond within an hour or less to whatever issue there might be along the pipeline system.
Rich?
Yeah, outside of what John just said, we still have a fully staffed operations department that will look at any event at the plant and address it accordingly. Who is in place? It's my operations department, supported by security, health, physics, maintenance. So we still have our whole staff that can address these issues.
Thank you. Mr. Sullivan, was your question answered sufficiently? We got a lot more questions coming up, so I just want to move forward quickly.
Just one more time. If something happens at the plant, it's a radiological emergency, it's the county that's going to take responsibility? And if it's a pipeline, it's going to be the local first responders, and coordination comes through Holtec as to determine what's going on.
Let's take it in two pieces. County first.
Sure, thank you, Susan Spear.
Right.
So if the county receives an alert that there is a radiological incident, that's when the county would, along with the state, would get involved and make determinations into whether there should be shelter in place or an evacuation. We look at all kinds of things like direction of the wind, the level of the radiological release, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, I mean, Holtec would take responsibility for the actual physical response on the site. The county would be making the decisions about public actions resulting from that release.
Okay.
And the data on the radiological release would also be coming from the monitors on site that Holtec would be informing us on.
Okay.
Yeah, so our emergency plan dictates that. So we would look at the plume, and then we would give correspondence to Westchester County as far as which sector to evacuate and when and where.
Okay.
The second part of the question?
So the
Gas rupture.
I guess from a radiological perspective, it starts with us at Indian Point.
Okay.
And then we have our emergency plan procedures that go out to the county, right, to facilitate the corrective actions.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Well, I want to make sure to get to the second part of the question on
Which
the
was-
pipeline, who's in charge?
Right.
First responders, you want John and Roberto?
Sure. On a pipeline rupture, we're certainly going to coordinate with first responders, but we will be in charge of the pipeline, and the chief and his team would be responsible for the perimeter of the other areas outside the pipeline.
So this is Susan. I think one good way to think about it is Holtec and Enbridge would be responsible for their physical facility, whereas the public agencies would be responsible for the public response. So for Chief Rosario, it's going to be working on putting out the fire, and for us, it's going to be looking at the radiological exposure.
That's a great way to explain it. Thank you.
Alerting the public.
Yes, of course.
Come through the county. Okay.
Absolutely. That's what I meant by
Yeah.
public.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we'll move on to...
Tony, just 1 second. I believe we have Susan Leifer on the line.
Okay.
Who asked a couple of those questions.
Okay, Ms. Leifer, if you'd like to ask a follow-up question, go ahead.
Yeah, hi. The follow-up question is, it's not clear. Somebody is going to have to make an immediate, first, and fast decision. You have a lot of people who have input. It's not clear that you have a overall design or an overall head so that things happen quickly and effectively. And suppose this happens like 12 o'clock at night or 3 in the morning. You don't necessarily have people available or on staff or at the plant or at Holtec that are there to start making decisions.
The
We're on
3
site
a.m. question.
24/7, so.
Sorry? Yeah. Go, say that again, please.
We're on site 24/7, everybody knows that, so we would respond accordingly, whether it's 3 in the morning or 3 in the afternoon, right? And then, again, we follow our protocols, we contact Westchester County if there's a release outside the site boundary, and then we'll go from there.
County, this is Susan Spear, county dispatches 24/7, 365. So we
Thank
can
you.
dispatch our first responders 24/7.
And can I just ask a second question? If cell phones are not allowed, how are they going to communicate with each other?
We wouldn't depend on cell phones to contact the county, right? We would use the Part 1 form that goes through the telephone system, the landline telephone system, in addition to direct communication with Westchester County. We wouldn't call cell phones. And besides, this all happens inside the control rooms themselves, right? Either Unit 2 or Unit 3.
And between people, in other words, once you activated the emergency people, how are they going to communicate? One of the bad things that happened in 9/11 is there was a real breakdown of communication. What's set in place now so the communication will act smoothly?
What's the question?
Hi,
I think
this
yeah, go ahead,
is
Susan.
Susan Spear. So, partly as a result of 9/11, a lot of lessons learned there, but the county does have tremendous redundancy in its first responder communications and dispatch system, so I feel very confident about that.
I'm not sure if Jennifer Waka, you're familiar enough to describe the FirstNet system?
Some days my hazmat days.
Yes.
Slightly, but I would never presume to take the place of my colleagues. But it's not a static and consistent hazard everywhere all at the same time, right? So part of the initial response actions is to define the parameters of that. And outside of the parameters are safe areas to communicate and operate and coordinate, which is by protocol where they would establish incident command structures and such. There is usually equipment capabilities to operate in hazardous environments, but those are controlled entries, those are done by specially trained responders with the right equipment and the right protective gear. But keep in mind that it's not a problem everywhere equally. Part of the response is to shape that and find the boundaries of that and then implement protection as appropriate.
Yeah, thanks for that. I was speaking specifically to the state's FirstNet cellular coverage for first responders and government officials during events that are significant events, so that there's bandwidth in the cellular coverage to allow for first responders to communicate. So that was a lesson learned after 9/11, the communications. So Susan, you're exactly right that there was problems after 9/11. There has been a state contract with cellular providers to create this FirstNet system that will allow for government first responders to be able to communicate even during a high traffic cellular event like that. Tony, back to you.
All right, we'll move on to training and drills. And the question there is, there has never been an emergency drill held in Westchester County, OEM, and relevant state and federal agencies to prepare for an incident involving the pipeline and plant. Will Susan Spear, Westchester County, and DPS commit to holding such a drill? And how can this community be repeatedly told that there's nothing to worry about when nobody ever has run a drill?
Go ahead.
Hi, Susan Spear. So we just did it in September 12th. Regarding the second part of the question, I don't think anybody from the county has ever made that statement and would not make that statement. We understand that as low as the risk might be, the impact is potentially very high, and we would always be actively preparing. And
Right, but then when Tina brought up, like, you're going to knock on every door, you were kind of like, So, I mean, I have a question for the chief. When you normally do trainings as first responders, what do the normal trainings that you do for your department look like?
So there's various different topics. So it could be anything going from fire suppression, a medical-related scenario, something on the water, since we operate marine units, also going towards the pipeline. We also have a UTV, so we also train in that aspect too if there was ever
What's a
fire.
UTV? I don't know what that stands for.
Off-road vehicle.
Oh, ATV, okay.
Yeah, so we operate that as well, so in case of scenario, something along those lines out there or in a wooded area, we're always going to be prepared.
And are they all virtual online trainings and you never get the first responders together to actually physically practice any of this? Or are they in person with like a human pretending to be the injured party?
So the majority of our trainings are all in person with all our members. Yes, we do have virtual tabletop drills for certain scenarios, but the majority of our training is all in person, all hands on.
Okay.
And Susan Spear, can I just add, the county has a fire training center, second busiest in the state, and we do extensive courses there for fire departments, including the ones.
But not on pipeline fires, right? Like,
Well,
that's
on
what
a
I'm trying to
vari-
get at, is
on a
like
variety
normally
of
when our first
hazmat-
responders are training for this stuff, it's intensive, so that in an emergency, they know exactly what to do. But the one about the pipeline blowing up under the nuke plant was virtual, and That's it, and we just heard Enbridge say that they don't provide any training materials. So it's like, how are they training it sounds like they're saying they don't train people, but then you are calling what happened, the virtual tabletop thing is a training, and you said it was comprehensive, but it's not like any other training that our first responders do for emergencies. So we're supposed to say this one virtual thing, everybody's ready to go.
I don't think we're going to say that. I'm sorry. Yeah, I don't think anyone is saying that. And I think from our standpoint, we observed that exercise. We're still processing that. I expect we're going to want to see additional exercises. And so I don't think anyone is saying one and done. I think we should constantly stay vigilant and look for new opportunities.
And to clarify, this was the first time that anything had been done with Enbridge?
As far as a drill?
Yeah.
Exercise? John?
As far as this tabletop exercise, yes, but we hold liaison meetings.
Have you had any responders from New York State, Westchester County, Rockland, or Putnam ever attend any of these liaisons?
I would say we have, yes. We hold them every two or 3 years. They're regional liaison meetings. We invite all first responders in.
And who's attended them from this area?
I couldn't tell you tonight who attended, but...
Chief, do you know if anybody from your department attended any of these liaisons?
We've been holding these for years and years. We've been holding these types of liaison meetings.
Chief, do you know if anybody from your department's ever attended a liaison with Enbridge?
So I can't really speak on anyone's behalf, so I wouldn't be able to give you a straight answer on that. But like I said, we do training throughout the year, whether it be tabletop or, like you said, a liaison or something.
Have you ever gone to one of theirs that they've held?
Me personally?
Yeah.
I wouldn't say I have personally.
Did you know that they existed until tonight?
Well, yeah, so I don't want to say that we don't know they exist, because they have good communication with us, the county. So whether or not they happen once a week, once a year, twice a year, 3 times a year, it happens. You can't just get 5 different entities together and act like you're never going to have an incident. So yes, it does happen. And does it happen on a daily basis? No, but it does happen.
It's gotta happen under regulations every few years. I think that's what John was referring to. And I think it would be a fair question to, as a follow-up, to just get, from the last few regulatory required liaison meetings, who attended from this region, and we can follow up with that.
May I just add
yes,
one more thing?
Please.
So at our fire training center, we do have very real live fires that we do train firefighters on. In fact, one of our facilities is a gas facility that Con Ed built with us, and it is controllable, admittedly, but they do create live fire from a gas leak.
And what's the diameter of the pipeline that they're using there? 42 inches with 850 PSI?
Obviously not.
Obviously not. I said it was a controlled fire for safety reasons, but it gives the firefighters an indication of how to respond to the fire, what to look for, a lot of different aspects of it. So it is a live fire training situation, not a tabletop.
I think Mayor Knickerbocker had her hand up, too, to try to weigh in on this. Mayor Knickerbocker? I thought she did. Teresa, are you available for?
Yes, I'm.
Okay, go ahead.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, good. So listen, I just want to make a few comments on this. When the pipeline first went in, I had requested Spectra at the time to have a training for the local first responders, and they did. We had it at the Buchanan Firehouse, so that was one of the first meetings, and the different fire departments, Verplanck, Montrose, Buchanan, whoever were the first responders were there. I want to also comment on communication. The Village of Buchanan has Code Red, and also the town of Portland has something similar. So if there's an emergency situation, we have to get out to our residents. we could use the code red communication, or the Village of Buchanan also has something where they can communicate through a direct email. And my staff is excellent. If there's an emergency, even at 3 o'clock in the morning, we would be on top of that immediately. Let me just see what else I wanted to comment on. But yes, I was on the last training that Enbridge had done. I thought it was excellent, and I thought the involvement and the first responders were very engaged, and it was a scenario-based thing, and it went very well.
Mayor Knickerbocker, do you know if there had been any of those prior to the one that you requested?
Before that, this was just after the 42-inch pipeline went in, and I just thought it was appropriate since then that, you know, people became a little more, the first responders were some type of a training on that. Before that, I'm not sure. To be really honest with you, I am not sure.
Yeah, I think, and that I think is really telling, that until our local elected official took the initiative to request that, nobody had any recollection of it ever happening. And I have spoken to a lot of first responders. Peekskill may be a different municipality, but it is not far from this plant, that have no idea how to respond to this. That have told me they do not know. The trainings that they get are like, you know, people coming in and dropping off a binder that no one's ever going to read. And that is why I asked this question, because I don't think a tabletop drill is sufficient. And did your tabletop drill assume that every living being within like 1.5 miles of the rupture had evacuated? Because in the rupture that Enbridge allowed to happen by shoddy maintenance in Kentucky, they had a woman who died, Lisa Derringer. They couldn't recover her body because it was so hot, and she was 1,000 feet away from this thing. So like, are the trainings accounting for the fact that these are massive fires and that normally you can't send people in to rescue anyone? Like my kids at Buchanan Verplank Elementary, 400 feet from the pipeline. Those are the kind of emergency drills that we need, and I really don't think it is at all fair to expect our first responders, who will not ever say no to helping us, to respond to this kind of thing without adequate training. And I think it's sad that it takes the mayor to insist on Spectra holding one of these things, to have one in anyone's memory, and then that this most recent one earlier this month was the first one that the county held. Those pipelines have been in the ground since the 1950s. And we're talking about a handful of things only after years of raising a fuss to demand that our first responders get adequate training.
Yeah, I'd like to just provide a little more context to that. A few years ago, the DPS team took an initiative in a FERC regulatory proceeding, and to my knowledge, it may have been the first in the country where this occurred, and we were successful in that rate proceeding to get money set aside for the Verplank Fire District. So I just want to underscore that DPS has been active in this as well.
Thank you. And frankly, Enbridge is the one making money off of this, and it's enough for our tax dollars to be doing all this training. They should be ponying up and doing the right thing for our community.
All right, thank you. We have one more question
Could I also add something with the training? I'm sorry.
It's okay, go ahead, Mayor.
Okay, so after this training, I thought it was appropriate that there was actually a walkthrough of the pipeline area for our first responders, so that they would be more comfortable on the path of it and have a better understanding, how far it goes into the woods, where it's located. So, and I know there's going to be other trainings. Enbridge had said they would continue to do trainings, but I think that one, I'm a very visual person, so I think that would help the first responders a whole lot, to be able to do a visual where the lines are and do a walkthrough.
I think there's a couple of follow-ups from that line of questioning. We already discussed sort of do a look back of several rounds of the multi-year liaison meetings. And also, there was money already paid out to Verplank pursuant to the FERC proceeding. But further follow-up with the first responders in the region, I think, is warranted. And, I'd also just like to thank Courtney and others. We are listening. There is a heightened sensitivity associated with the co-location, with the pipelines. And I think the questions are helpful in identifying areas for improvement. So this would be another takeaway there. And I think everyone agrees more communication is better with the first responders. And, that's an easy takeaway in my opinion. Okay, Tony, back to the questions.
Thanks. Outreach and communications. What kind of outreach and training will be initiated for emergencies? How does a Westchester resident know what to do to protect themselves in an emergency? We need clear, consistent emergency information for safety. How will you ensure this?
Who do we have taking this one? Susan again? To start? No?
Well, I feel like
We've covered
been
it?
through this quite a bit, but
Okay.
I can answer specific.
We can
specific
skip right to
questions.
follow-ups.
Why don't we ask Sally and Susan if they have follow-ups based on the previous answers? Okay.
Ms. Leifer, or
Yes, it's Leifer here, Susan Leifer. Thank you. It's, my experience is that if you prepare for something very well, when something really happens, you don't start thinking so much. If you have a pattern in place, you react automatically, and that helps you through an emergency. What appears is that we've had really no training of the public, not enough training of the first responders. I agree with the statement that we should really up this and do more of it and make it more visible and make it more open to the community so they know what they're doing. I think the worst thing that can happen is something happens that you haven't trained for and nobody knows what to do. And mostly when an emergency happens, some element of it is surprise. And at least the parts that you can imagine get practiced so that people know what to do and have an idea what to do, and it cuts down on the panic.
thank you. Is Ms. Gellert on the line? No? Okay, those are the end of the questions that we have. We're running a little late, so I think it's probably appropriate at this time to pass it over to...
Tony, thank you so much for facilitating the public forum, and thank you to those who submitted questions in advance for the forum. Man, I know that you also had something to ask, but we've gone through the pre-submitted questions already, and we're about 15 minutes a little behind, but I think we might be able to get through the next presentation ahead of schedule, and if there's time at the end, we can turn back to more questions, if that's all right. But we've repeatedly missed some of the presentations that were planned on the agenda. I'd like to try to stick to it if possible. Is that all right? I think you were the only one that we had an additional question. Is it?
I'll go at the end if there's...
Okay, thank you. I appreciate it. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Kelly Turturro from the DEC, who will give a presentation on the monitoring working group. I think just for context, folks know that we have a school monitoring working group we established after the first meeting to evaluate opportunities for environmental monitoring. There was a primary concern about the school community. Since we started our work, there's been other interests beyond just the school for the broader community, wanting to have more robust monitoring in the village as well. And so the working group and the agency staff have been taking that feedback, taking the inputs that we received from the school group at Columbia University. We've met with a number of other entities that do monitoring, and it has informed our work. I want to thank many agency staff that have been involved in this, especially from the DEC and the DOH. Their monitoring experts have greatly assisted us in understanding the best approaches to take. So with that, I want to turn over to Kelly to provide a status report and some recommendations for next steps. Kelly.
Thank you, Tom. You've done a great job banking my presentation.
I don't mean to steal any thunder.
It's okay. It's all right. No, it was a very nice lead-in. Again, I'm Kelly Turturro. I'm the Regional Director for DEC's Hudson Valley office, and I'm very happy to be able to give this presentation on behalf of our school monitoring working group. As Tom said, we had a number of Decommissioning Oversight Board members, in addition to experts both in the Department of Environmental Conservation as well as the New York State Department of Health, and Dave Lockbaum, our technical expert, assisting us through this process. So what I want to do is I'd just like to start with a little bit of background on where we started, what information that we brought together, what we've learned from our technical experts, and then what our ultimate recommendations will be and what our next steps will be. There is more work to do, but as I said, I just want to go through a background and then we'll present on the recommendations. So first, as Tom mentioned, the School Monitoring Working Group was established at the first meeting of the Decommissioning Oversight Board in June 2021. We had a few goals in establishing this working group. We wanted to develop a better understanding of the potential environmental and health risks that decommissioning could present to the BV Elementary School. We also wanted to assess best monitoring practices, and then finally issue recommendations to the Hendrick-Hudson School District. So the working group has met 8 times to discuss and learn about monitoring protocols over the last year and a half. At our October 2021 Decommissioning Oversight Board meeting, our independent technical expert, Dave Lockbaum, presented on the working group's initial findings and recommendations for a path forward. The key takeaways he presented on were that the likelihood of contaminants reaching the school is extremely low. However, monitoring can provide assurances to the community. And then also current real-time radiological monitors remain in place until spent fuel transfer is complete. And Holtec has advised that that is expected at the earliest in late 2023. So with that, the School Monitoring Working Group indicated that a monitoring plan for the BV school and the community should be in place ahead of heavy demolition activities at Indian Point. And a $500,000 grant was secured for that monitoring. Finally, we also had outreach from Columbia University Professor Jonathan Hollander, who proposed an educational exercise for students to offer monitoring suggestions to the working group, and we took them up on that. So the students worked on these monitoring suggestions and presented 3 alternatives to us in May 2022. Those 3 alternatives were: 1, maintain existing monitoring equipment and protocols, or purchase additional real-time particulate matter and VOC monitors to be located at the school, or purchase additional real-time particulate matter, VOC, and radiation monitors to be located at the school. Our technical experts in state government provided peer review of ambiguities and inaccuracies in the written report that we received from the students, and the working group awaits a final report from Columbia Professor Hollander. So now I just want to turn to a few items that we've learned through this working group, and to start with the existing monitoring and safeguards that are in place. So all demolition work is subject to local demolition permits, and those permits will require dust mitigation and suppression. There are state environmental regulations, And there are also strict workforce safety standards. So testing for the presence of asbestos, lead, and other contaminants before structures are taken down. If contaminants are found, that will trigger specific disposal, monitoring, and worker safety standards. And what we learned was that the worker safety standards serve as the first and most accurate line of detection for the school and for the community. And as we've talked about before at our Decommissioning Oversight Board meetings, there is an on-site New York State inspector monitoring the work as well. There is also a network of radiological monitors on site, on workers, and as Rich mentioned earlier, there are 16 around the site perimeter, including 2 near the BV school. There will be on-site dust control measures and an off-site dust complaint reporting and investigation procedure that will be required through the village demolition permits. But most importantly, in all cases, fugitive demolition dust must not leave the site. Dave Lockbaum, our technical expert, has also done some research into other nuclear power plants that are undergoing decommissioning activities. And what he found was that there are identical and comparable measures that are in place at these other nuclear facilities to prevent hazards to workers and the public. So I mentioned that the school working group also consulted with state experts from both the Department of Environmental Conservation and the Department of Health. And what we learned there was that on-site continuous air monitors in the immediate vicinity of demolition activity offer the most timely and beneficial information to protect the community. These provide early warning and near real-time results. Monitoring further out beyond the fence line may not be as useful for a few reasons. There's greater potential for interference from background readings. It's more difficult to determine the source, and there is a need to account for long-range transport of pollutants to the monitors. So before we turn to the working group's recommendations based on all that we have learned, I just wanted to pause and discuss this concept of heavy demolition. This is the demolition of concrete buildings with thick walls, specifically the spent fuel pool buildings, turbine buildings, and domes. And what we've done as a working group is we're looking to that point in time as a goal to have something in place for the community. So timing, as Holtec has advised us, is that in late 2023 at the earliest, heavy demolition will take place, and that is after all spent fuel transferred to dry cast storage and vessel segmentation within the containment domes underwater and under negative pressure is complete. So moving to our recommendations. So based on all of what we've learned, the working group will recommend that a community air monitoring plan be developed. So how will we do that? First of all, the contracting entity for this community air monitoring plan will be New York State on behalf of the Decommissioning Oversight Board. What we will do, and I'll present the time frame next, and it's a pretty tight time frame to make sure we can meet this 2023 deadline. But we're going to issue a request for proposals to secure an environmental consulting service to develop a community air monitoring plan with primary focus on fence line monitors. This RFP will also include potential substances of concern, including radioactive materials, non-radiological particulate exposure resulting from demolition activities, and on-site meteorological monitoring to account for upwind and downwind conditions. It will include a plan for the BV school and take into account baseline normal activity picked up by the monitors. The state will also be assembling amongst various agencies a technical expert panel to support the RFP and assess the proposals that we get for the community air monitoring plan. So this final slide just shows our targeted dates and completions. As I mentioned, it's a very tight time frame, but we are going to work, as I said, to get this plan in place and operational by the time heavy demolition takes place. So thank you all for your time, and we welcome any questions from the board members.
Thank you, Kelly. Questions for Kelly? Yeah, sure.
I'm sorry that I don't know this, but what was the composition of the working group?
So we formed the working group, I think, after the first DOB meeting, and it consists of a subgroup of several of us.
But who are the several of you? That's what I'm asking.
Tom Kaczmarek, it's all the members of the working group. Dave Lockbaum. Everybody raise your hand. Who's on?
And we also enlisted some support from the Department of Health, who have been important partners. Yes, Richard Webster has been a partner of that as well. So it's pretty robust group.
And maybe this is for the superintendent, but anybody else from the school community besides yourself?
Yeah, the school district consulted with, outside of the working group, consulted with environmental experts through our Board of Cooperative Educational Services through BOCES. There was a time in the early deliberations when the funding was awarded to the school district that we thought we were doing this heavy lift on our own. So we went off and tried to talk to people. David Lockbaum led a meeting with our Board of Education back in April. And there, the decision that was around the time the working group came together, but these outcomes would not be able to be handled by our own, but we did, or I did through BOCES, an arm of the State Education Department, worked with environmental technical expert that basically said this is out of their league.
Okay. I'm sorry, can I just go back one slide? Because
Sure.
I had a question on one other.
And Catherine, you're welcome to join us at any.
I'm not looking for more
Okay,
work. I just want to know.
Okay. Previous slide.
I'm sorry, maybe it's one more from that. I'm curious about, no, I guess it's one more from that. I'm curious about some of the, this monitoring beyond the fence because greater potential for interference from background readings. But that so greater interference means there's additional potential contaminants that would glom up to be a giant contaminant?
Right. When you're talking about particulate matter, right?
Yeah.
Particulate matter comes from a lot of sources. Your wood-burning fireplace, your diesel bus.
If I'm worried about my kids breathing in particulate matter, I don't really care what the source is, right?
Well, look.
No,
obviously,
I'm saying what you're saying is that there might be other stuff there, and I'm saying that makes it worse. We don't want to know that.
We are developing monitoring plans specific to the concern that the decommissioning activities are going to be contaminating the community, right?
Okay.
And so there's also there's a regulatory aspect to that as well, right? We want to know if there's something leaving the site. Your underlying point is a broader question that all of us care about the environment as a whole. But there's many sources of these contaminants. And we live with these contaminants every day, right? And we want to do everything we can to reduce those air emissions and that's why we have renewable energy policies. That's why we are greening up our transportation sector. There's a lot of reasons why we want to reduce those air emissions. This monitoring plan has to be geared towards addressing the decommissioning activities. We are responding to that concern.
Okay.
So that's why this this fence line monitor strategy is so important. That said, we're still having the monitor at the school as well.
Okay.
But
I'm not
monitoring plan has to adjust for normal activities. I'm sorry to interrupt. Go ahead. No, please, go. Okay. Sorry. Anybody else?
I had a
Yes, Victoria.
question. So looking at the timeline, it's really tight, and it is time for the anticipated construction. But I was wondering if you had any plan in place in case your timeline for the monitoring project was delayed, or in the unlikely case that the deconstruction begins earlier and the monitoring isn't in place yet, would the deconstruction be delayed to account for the monitoring?
I think that's a very good question. I think that we have a rough schedule from Holtec where we know that the spent fuel has to get on dry cast before they are going to be commencing that heavy demolition. And there are other things as well in terms of the vessel segmentation and things of that nature that have to occur before they would commence that. So we think there's room beyond December for us to get this in place. We're trying to be aggressive on the schedule so that we're well ahead of it. I think at the time that we will have to be in communication with Holtec all throughout the process of us developing the plan. And if there's a need for coordination, we can communicate with Holtec about that.
Thanks.
Tom, could the Buchanan Building Department hold up the building permits?
Mayor, that's a good question for you.
Good question.
Not sure if Mayor Knickerbocker, are you with us?
Or
Look, I think
they could be done on
yeah.
condition that the noise monitoring is in place.
Mhm.
That's how they could do it.
Well, that's something we could take back. I think that's it. Catherine, I feel like I cut you off before. Did you have another further question? I'm very sorry. I did. I'm really sorry. But did you want to ask the?
I think the moment has passed, but, what you're basically saying is, 100 units of contaminant already exist, and we're gonna drop 1,000 more, but that 100 doesn't count anymore. And what I'm saying is, it's not only I agree with you, of course, because, not dumb, but wanting to know the source, but I think it makes it a slightly more terrible situation if what we're saying is, oh, and by the way, there's also this other lot of contaminants that exist there. Like, that doesn't seem like unuseful information for us all to know. That's my point.
Right. I get the point, and I guess I was enthusiastically responding to the point you were making before because we've gone around on this a lot. And the issue with these monitors is, what are we measuring for? The VOCs that come from the dry eraser boards in your classroom? The particulate matter that is absolutely spiking at school grounds when the schools come to pick up the kids? That's not what we are monitoring for. Those things are things the community should always think about and be concerned about. But that's not the activity that we are putting this effort forward to address.
If I could, one of the concerns I had is with the monitoring, what triggers an action by whom, and we heard earlier today about emergency planning, who does what to whom, kids inside, close windows, call parents, evacuate, that's where my mind goes. And that prompted a discussion of our working group to say, well, whatever those actions are down the line, regardless of where the monitors are, if we don't have a baseline first at the school or in the surrounding community before any activity takes place, so we need to know what is currently out there to measure against. What I then became fearful of with the input of the technical experts is that we're going to be reacting to the wrong contaminants. I'm not saying that there are any contaminants we shouldn't be concerned about, and I think that's what you're saying. But we don't want to have a false positive in that a set of actions are being taken by the school district in conjunction with many other municipalities or agencies if it's not what we intend to measure to begin with.
So the fallacy I see in that argument is that I think you do want to know if there's contamination, and you do still want to close the windows and call the parents if there's contamination, right?
Which is the
So what
baseline
you're saying
testing.
is, right, no, I understand that, and what you're saying is the regulatory component of this, which I'm not disagreeing with, is to know what, what's happening as a result of this demolition. And we do want to know that, and I think that's good data to have. But I think the problem is that if we have a situation where the air is already dirty for, just in the vernacular, adding this is going to make it worse, exacerbates the emergency to a real degree when it comes to, and I'm not saying something that you don't also feel, like taking care of our children's actual health. So I don't see that. I mean, I don't want to belabor this point anymore, but I don't see that knowing those things hurts us, I guess.
Oh, I think we want to know that. Yeah, we agree with you. We want to know that. That's the baseline that Joe is referring to. I think we need to know, and I think the Columbia students mentioned the importance of the baseline as well, and to know the different sources.
Just because I represent Peekskill and my hometown of Austin, which we are, environmental justice communities, there's a lot of crap going on in these communities.
Right, exactly.
Like literally and figuratively.
Yes. No, it's a good point.
And Tom, if I can just jump in, we're putting my DEC hat on, understanding what the baseline is may allow DEC and DOH to step in if we're seeing things that are not consistent with our regulatory standards outside of the work on the Decommissioning Oversight Board. So I appreciate you raising that, Catherine.
I think that if there are no other questions on the monitoring presentation, we have 10 minutes left, and there were some additional questions that came in. Man, there are two questions. Sorry, Tom. I'm just going to call on Jacqueline Dreschler first, and then to Manager Green. So I think we'll have time for two questions. I believe Jacqueline is on virtually. Jacqueline?
Hi there, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Oh, okay, great. So first of all, I wanted to say one thing. I wanted to thank Courtney for mentioning Rockland County and all of this planning and preparedness and everything. Rockland County is never mentioned, and parts of Rockland County are within this 10-mile zone. And so I get very upset when I come to these meetings and there's absolutely no mention of Rockland County in all of this planning. That's number one. Number two, I wanted to say that years ago when the bomb trains were coming through Rockland County, I helped to make damn sure that CSX was the one that was paying for all of the massive training and supplies for that training for preparedness should there be a bomb train incident. And the county did not pay for that, CSX did. So on to my question, which really is off topic, but I'm just going to say my piece and thank you. Speaking of risk profiles, my topic is regarding the future releases of radioactive wastewater into the Hudson River, which flows both ways from the Albany area to New York City port. There are 7 towns upriver which rely on Hudson River water for their daily needs, bathing, drinking, cooking, brushing teeth, etc. Those 7 towns have 106,000 people, and there are many, many more who use the river water for the ancillary purposes. As we all know, because it has been heavily reported in the news, Holtec has requested permission to dump radioactive wastewater from their Pilgrim plant decommissioning into Cape Cod Bay in Massachusetts. One can deduce from Holtec's Pilgrim plan that Holtec may be requesting to pump and dump radioactive wastewater from the cooling ponds and other facilities collections areas beyond the usual speedies permits that are for storm and wastewater at Indian Point. There's no way to remove tritium from the Hudson River waters, and the NRC has stated, and I quote, "In principle, no dose should be acceptable if it can be avoided," end quote. It can and must be avoided. There is no safe level, not by the NRC, the EPA, or the DEC standards. The Hudson River has already been strangulated from decades of industrial waste. Has the NRC updated any of its outdated health-related and scientific facts? The NRC seems to be relying on archaic reasoning and allows for many exclusions, waivers, and exceptions to the company Holtec, which has no or little to none experience in decommissioning nuclear power plants. My question regards public health and safety, and it's to the town of Cortland. Will the town of Cortland consider creating a resolution stating that for multiple reasons it is opposed to the possibility of Holtec dumping radioactive wastewater, which includes strontium-90 and tritium, as part of Holtec's chief decommissioning plan into our Hudson River, the river that flows both ways? Other towns and communities and counties are considering this. Will you? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jacqueline. If Dave Lockbaum is still with us, do you want to address the question regarding whether NRC has updated its standards?
Yes, I forget the exact time frame, but about 8 to 10 years ago, the NRC revised its regulations or its process for determining how much money an owner can spend to reduce radiation that's released to the air, water, and also exposure to workers. They had been using an outdated figure from like 1979, and they updated that to say that the owner must spend more to lower radiation. It's called a LAR, as low as reasonably achievable. The NRC has not changed other regulations in terms of how much radioactivity can be released to the air and water, as has been done at Pilgrim and Indian Point for decades. So it's not really dumping water, it's discharging water after being treated and verified to be below the federal limits. And I looked at the data for both Pilgrim and Indian Point, and what has traditionally been released from the plant over the last 20 years is less than 5% of that federal limit.
Right, I thank you, Mr. Lockbaum. I understand that you're saying that this has been going on since Indian Point was being even considered to be built. And I remember reading that it was said, oh, it doesn't matter about dumping radioactive water into the Hudson. No one's ever going to be drinking it. And that is so not true. It is very much not true. There are a lot of people who do drink this water. Tritium cannot be taken out. And if we're having bigger releases, we're not talking about the usual 60 gallons a day or whatever has been allowed, and the usual speedies releases that are typical. I'm talking about beyond that. This needs to be looked at, and I know that the people in Massachusetts are very upset about this, and I'm hoping that people along the Hudson River will be very upset about this. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Thank you, Jack.
I guess to complement that, the other thing I looked at when I traveled up to Pilgrim in May of this year and met with some of the folks up there, and I asked, well, if you can't release it to the bay or to the river, what do you do with it? You can't, there's no time machine to go back and uncreate the tritium, so what do you do with it? Do you ship it out west and create an environmental justice thing, bury it out in Idaho? I haven't found a solution, an alternative to discharging it to the river at less than 5% of the federal limit that deals with the problem any better.
Thank you. Manna, are you ready for the question?
Excuse me, Tom, may I
I'm
respond
sorry.
regarding Rockland County?
Okay,
I just
yes.
wanted to
Sure.
assure the questioner that Rockland County has been very directly involved in our emergency planning and preparedness, as has Orange and Putnam County and New York State.
Thank you.
So please feel
Thank you.
assured that Rockland is deeply involved.
I think there are a couple others that want to weigh in, but I want to get to Manna's question while we have time. So, Manna, go ahead.
And before I bring up my question, which is actually a follow-up to what Jackie just brought up, I want to just commend the Decommissioning Oversight Board. This is a really valuable conversation tonight, and I'm very proud of how this board is coming around to really having constructive dialogue, and I particularly want to thank Assemblywoman Sandy Galiff and State Senator Peter Harcum for the work that they did to create this body. This region is a lot safer because of this board. And I also have questions about the water treatment that is occurring. I thank Rich Baroni for sending the report on the effluent releases, and I'm still sorting through it and trying to process it, but I think it's an important conversation to have. It's my understanding that at Pilgrim, they have actually, because of the fishing industry, they've actually banned the discharge of at least, I believe, the water from the fuel pools, treated or not, into Cape Cod Bay. On the other hand, my understanding is that at Oyster Creek, the water has been discharged to the ocean. It's important to understand what is going to happen when that fuel pool water is ready to be treated and then released, and especially because not all, the treatment does not remove all. It may remove to NRC standards, the heavier isotopes, but how serious is the tritium burden? And to Dave Baum's question, what else could be done with it? If you evaporate it, then it's for all of us to breathe. So I think this is worth a deeper dive than we've had so far, and I just really want to point to that. It isn't so much a question as a suggestion moving forward, because what happens at this Decommissioning Oversight Board is going to reverberate throughout the country, because this is the first entity of this nature, and I think you are doing a really good job. So let's look at that and some of the other issues that we've suggested, but I think that is more urgent, because it won't be that long before the fuel pools are emptied, and it may take the same kind of subcommittee to focus on that to really get the best possible answer. And I want to thank the subcommittee, and also ask Kelly if I could send a copy of that report to Eric Epstein, who it has become an emergency response and monitoring expert from 3 Mile Island. So, sure. Thank you.
Thank you, Mina. I think we have a number of hands up. Victoria?
So, really quick, thank you, Mina. In just response to the instant line of questions and comments, Riverkeeper thinks that it would be very useful for the public to see analysis of the different alternatives of disposal, perhaps at one of these presentations, just so people can understand what options we do have available. I don't know if that would best come from Holtec or if Dave Lockbaum or the state were able to do it, but we think that would be very helpful for people to understand. In addition, I know we're short in time, so I don't need an answer today, but I do want upon the record there are 2 outstanding questions that Richard Webster had asked, and you, Mr. Brony, had said you would follow up. One is on metallic, the metal that's in the dry cask and how that functions, and the second is on damaged fuel. We're interested in knowing the amount of damaged fuel that is at Indian Point and the procedures that will be used to load that. Thank you.
I think the one was answered. Go ahead, Rich.
So those are good questions, and I did answer Richard in a memo with some information, and I believe Tom posted it on the website.
It is.
So if you just look at the website, I answered Mr. Webster's questions from the last meeting.
For both of them?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. And on the virtual line, we have a couple of hands up. Mayor Knickerbocker?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
I just wanted to respond very quickly, because I know we're over time, to the discussion on whether we could hold back a permit, a demolition permit. I do not know the legality of that, but I do want to make a statement that our building inspector, Peter Cook, and Holtec have been working well together, and whatever Holtec has asked for, is asked for. They have complied with our building department.
Peter's here. He's nodding. Thank you, Peter.
Okay, good.
And we know Peter's been on site and has really been doing terrific work, working with DEC on developing conditions for the future heavy demolition permits, and we really appreciate the work you're doing. Thank you. I think there was also a hand up by Dave Lockbaum.
Yes, this is Dave Lockbaum. Speaking to the point of the spent fuel pool water, I looked a few years ago at the reports that are submitted annually by Pilgrim's owner to the NRC that accounted for all the radioactivity that went to the air or to the water. 94% of the tritium that left that plant was evaporated from the spent fuel pool, just normal evaporation. They weren't doing that specifically. Only 6% of the tritium was discharged to the water. So sitting around and waiting to figure out the solution, the tritium is just a radioactive form of water, so it evaporates just the same as the non-radioactive water. I also looked at the 3 Mile Island plant after its accident. It had over 100,000 gallons, close to 1 million gallons of very heavily contaminated water, including lots of tritium in that water. What they did there was evaporated it in boilers, so it went out to the air. And while the river may go both ways, the wind goes all ways. So I'm not sure that's a better solution. It's a less costly solution, but I'm not sure it's a better solution. The one other plant that did treat spent fuel pool water differently was Vermont Yankee. They shipped it in like 250 truck shipments out to Idaho and buried it in the ground.
So Dave has already done a fair amount of research on this topic, obviously. But Victoria's point is a good one, and I think an agenda item on a future meeting where we actually go into more depth on alternatives and look at what is the best practice and what has been done elsewhere is something that I think Dave Lockbaum could do. Dave, I'm putting you on the spot in a public meeting, but could I enroll you in making a presentation on kind of the alternatives analysis that Victoria suggested at a future meeting?
Sure, that information has already been gathered. It's just assembling it in a one presentation, no problem at all.
Thank you. Well, that's very good. Tom, do we have any other hands up? I'm sorry? Assemblywoman Gallup.
I just wanted to say something, and this is very off topic, but I wanted to say to Manajo how important it was that she was the founding, mother of the DOB, along with some other people. But, this is probably going to be my last meeting because we're called back to Albany in December. So I just want to thank everybody for, a wonderful, wonderful group. I mean, it's really developed so nicely, as you've said, with community participation, great board members. We have a wonderful chair, one that pulls, I can't believe what you do, Tom. You pull everybody together, you get these ideas going, and it's just been great. So I think we're a model, we know we're a model for the state of New York, but we're also a model for the nation, I would say. And so I think everybody looks at what we're doing here. There are a lot of plants closing, and there'll probably be more, so they will follow our prototype. So congratulations.
Thank you very much. And Sandy,
well
I
done.
did not know this was going to be your last meeting. I was planning your last meeting in
The
December.
speaker called us back.
Uh-huh.
For what, I don't know.
You have very important work here,
Well,
I don't know. We may be in session, but I know you'll do good work.
Well, I want to thank you for your involvement in this and for your leadership and for your friendship. You've been just a wonderful member of the DOB, so active, always with excellent questions. You're holding us all to a high standard, and we'll miss you very much. So thank you for your service. With that, I think we can adjourn for the evening. Thank you all very much.
So the retreat had